also to take the MHC in isolation and to say, hey, we've got this model of hierarchical complexity.
Yeah.
Let's map everything onto that.
Right.
As if all of our biases, all of our
right.
other beliefs and all the other elements that make up the soup of a human have nothing to do with it. It's just, hey, look at this beanpole of like development, and we can just stick our cultural levels here like baubles on a Christmas tree. It just doesn't really make sense, and you have your nice, neat little spiral, and it's bizarre when you get down to it.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Metamodern Meaning podcast. This is the first podcast so titled. New year, new channel. I'm kind of making a pivot to transition into a more kind of encompassing set of topics that can be explored here. Certainly still going to be talking about spirituality and meaning making, but metamodern meaning sounded like a very broad sweep of possibilities, and allows hopefully to explore not just meaning in metamodernity, but also the meaning of metamodernity, the meaning of metamodernism. And so I thought that, for the first kind of inaugural episode of this new framed podcast, that James Cussen would be a perfect person to talk to. James and I had already been discussing doing a podcast in response to his excellent series of critical essays on metamodernism. And this just seemed like a wonderful confluence of different opportunities to dig into what we mean by metamodernism. What is metamodernism? What could it mean? All these sorts of things, because James does an incredible job unpacking, critiquing, laying bare some issues, and bringing to light some really important things that need to be explored and critiqued in the metamodern conversation. James is an incredible content producer in terms of the channel that he's got on YouTube called The Living Philosophy. Also got a wonderful Substack by that name, The Living Philosophy, in which he posted this 6-part essay critique of metamodernism. And so, without further ado, James, welcome back to the Metamodern Now Meaning podcast, and thanks for writing this really excellent series of essays that we can dig into. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't sign up for the Metamodern Meaning podcast. I signed up for the Metamodern Spirituality podcast, but no, it's a
little bit of a bait and switch there.
Yeah. No, I'm delighted to. I saw you talking about it on the Facebook group, so it's I'm delighted to see it happen in real time for me. I'm like, oh, I'm on the Metamodern Meaning podcast. This is awesome.
Man. You're inaugurating it. So, I mean, but again, it's really apropos because this series of essays that you've written kind of demands an interrogation of what we mean by this term. What is metamodernism? What are we actually trying to refer to here? And laying, some big questions out there, challenges of how this term has been used and employed, and really digging into some of the presuppositions and kind of theoretical frameworks that some metamodern thinkers have been using around stage theories and whatnot. So, this seems like a great way to kick off this more expansive consideration of meaning, and specifically the meaning of metamodernism. So, to that end, why don't you set us up a little bit? What were you trying to do with this series, and maybe unpack a little bit some of the kind of core arguments and core ideas in it before we can dig into it kind of piece by piece?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was someone who fell in love with metamodernism through Ken Wilber's Integral, so that kind of happened for me around the same time, I guess. Back 2020, I discovered Wilbur, and then I'd already started reading Freinach's, like the Listening Society, the year before, or a couple of years before, but had been put off for reasons we'll be discussing. But then when I went back to it, I loved it. And yeah, since then, just digging into more works, made a video on metamodernism, had the conversation with you, and went down the rabbit hole of your podcasts, and at the same time getting into the sense makers and discovering, or maybe just feeling the vibe that I was like, all these people are clearly post-integral thinkers. All of these people have been through the same thing because there's similar mental models that are showing up implicitly. And so I went through that process of just total enchantment with the metamodern program. And then somewhere in the last year, there was just something that began to sit a bit wrong with me. There was something was itching me, and I don't know what started it, but this series was, I guess, my attempt to sit down and be like, and articulate what those issues were, and this is why it's structured as it's six pieces of like individual, almost more aphoristic kind of pieces rather than a linear chapter thing, because it's me approaching it, trying to articulate this thing, coming at it from different angles. And so even now I don't feel like, oh, I can give you, I know exactly what this critique is, I'm going to be able to spell it out. So there's going to be a lot of grasping still on my part here, but we had such a great chat and love your podcast. So it's just you're the perfect person to like sit down and just chat this through because you're such a an earnest and charitable kind of interpreter and interlocutor. So I'm quite kind of when I was setting off on that journey where we're going to do letters, we were going to do, but obviously, this is my project, and you were kind of like, oh, do I have time to do it? So I was looking forward to having this opportunity. So I'm really I'm really grateful we can sit down and do this and kind
Yeah.
of hopefully work through some of the blockages because I'm sure other people are having the same thing. I'm sure there's a lot of things within the metamodern community or elements within it that will feel similar ways.
Yeah, no, totally. And yeah, just briefly to that, you'd had the idea of doing kind of back and forth letter exchange as you were writing these critiques. And unfortunately, I was too slammed with a million other projects. I just couldn't do that. And this seemed like a good way of being able to, once you'd kind of thrown these ideas out there, now we can kind of dance with them and work with them. So, yes, I think this is really exciting. And let me say too, well, a couple things. One is what I really appreciate. I mean, this is excellent and important work because we need people questioning and critiquing these ideas. I think that what you're getting at in this series of essays is the kinds of questions we need to be asking. And so I applaud you for that. I also really appreciate just in general that like this is coming not from a sort of takedown perspective. This is a really good faith, someone who's engaged this paradigm, found it of value, but in the course of thinking more about it and really trying to drill down into it, found holes, problems, issues, and then kind of being just honest about that and trying to foreground that so that we're not just kind of falling into, prejudiced assumptions and
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
one of my primary things that I try and do is to try and understand the perspective from the other side, which I guess I probably, that's probably some software picked up from Wilbur or from metamodernism in general. But yeah, so I think in that it's imagining the other person as a human and having a perspective you can relate to, and so not go I think once you have that, it's hard to go into a takedown mindset. I mean,
Yeah.
you can drift into it. It's really not that hard actually,
Gosh, the
but
idea that
it's
other people have perspectives that we need to consider is a radical one, but I guess we can work with that now.
I'm here to teach you the ways.
No, no, you're totally right. It's that comes through that you're really genuinely engaging this and taking that perspective. And so yeah, but also not letting anyone off with a free pass too, that and hence the critical scrutiny that's required of this. But before we spend too much time talking about the conversation, let's get
Let's
into the
not be so
conversation.
meta about it.
So let's start out here with the first essay. And again, this is a six-part series, very digestible. I'll link to this so people can go check these out and read it for themselves. But yeah, one of the first things that you raise here is this question of like what's a metamodernism in the sense of are we talking about a trend here comparable to like the Baroque period or Impressionism or something, or are we talking about modernity and postmodernity? These are different kinds of categories, and there seems to have been various kinds of slippages, and whether or not any of these categories are even make any sense or are justified in being used. You're kind of throwing that out there. Unpack or present that argument a little bit,
Yeah,
and then we'll
so
just go into kind of a conversation around all this stuff.
I guess it's we're used to thinking of like aesthetic periodization, so the Baroque, neoclassical, these are clear artistic eras that we can point to. We can point to the qualities and traits of those, but we're not in the habit of talking about, the politics of the Baroque or the memes of, I don't know, neoclassical culture. We kind of have a nice boundary around those artistic domains. But then when it comes to modernism as an art movement rather than modernity as a time period, modernism is actually kind of postmodern art. If you think of the urinal floating
Yeah.
in the gallery, which was the first. What was that in the 1920s? That is the first express. That's called modern art. And then postmodernism is then, as I understand it, and maybe you can correct me here, but Lyotard, the one of the French post-structuralist theorists who coined the term postmodernism as a philosophical era, we'll say, who took it out of art because postmodernism originally was in architectural theory. So again, in the art, it was pointing to something that came after modernism as an artistic period. So again, we're looking more Baroque, neoclassical rather than the way we think of modernism, postmodernism,
Yeah.
metamodernism. And then you fast forward to the when metamodernism came along with Vermeulen and Van den Aker's paper in 2009. That's coming from two art theorists. So it still seems to fit within that thing of like, hey, are we talking about art or are we talking about everything? So yeah, my critique was with this was have we just taken a small thing and blown it out of all proportion? Because I know Lyotard regretted that naming of postmodernism. And when the likes of Jameson came along, and then it became a very mimetically charged term, and it took
Hmm.
off in a way that Lyotard didn't expect. I suspect he was being a bit tongue in cheek in the way a lot of the French postmodernists could be. Uh, he was being a bit playful with the use of that term, but then it caught on and got rigidified probably coming out of like and I think Vermeulen and Van der Acker coming out of this tradition as well is the Marxist periodization scheme. And that kind of again we're getting back to Hegel there because Marx taken his dialectical progressions from Hegel. So then that's where it's kind of becoming reified from like, hey, we're no longer talking about an art movement, we're talking about a cultural movement or we're talking about a
Yeah.
moment in time. And it's that blurry line that I think I don't know. There's something slippery in there that I was
Yeah.
trying to capture when it comes
Yeah.
to metamodernism.
So this is great. And so let me here are my thoughts on this, and then we can, dig in and so um yeah, and also the last kind of exposition that I'll give here is just that you'd written these pieces, and part of our initial thought about doing a letter exchange was that there could be kind of a back and forth, but in this case, sort of you've written all of them, and now in a sense, this is sort of
Yes.
an opportunity I have to try to respond to some of these, but also integrate the important critique that you're offering here. So I'll just say how I'm thinking about it, then you can tell me what you're thinking about what I'm thinking about it, which is so in its broadest terms, I think of metamodernism or the metamodern as first and foremost kind of a discourse. Means it's a bunch of people talking about something, and that's a very loose sense off out of the gate because we might have different senses of what this thing is. But I think that that's important to include in what this metamodern conversation is about, because when I talk about metamodernism, I'm, as I do in my book, synthesizing multiple strands, or at least bringing into dialogue multiple strands of conversation that are using this term, but might be using it in slightly different ways. And a big thing that I'm trying to do is find deeper continuities, deeper patterns across the different aspects of that conversation. So I want to say that up front, because I see metamodernism as a diverse discourse that is gesturing to something, but contains within it already a kind of plurality of some different perspectives on this topic and some different approaches. You've already named a number of them, but there's a kind of cultural studies one that's kind of begins by trying to talk about art. Then there's the Hansi Freinacht one, which again kind of brings in this sort of stage model developmental sequence to ideas that gets really kind of overtly kind of almost Hegelian or dialectically oriented. Then, of course, there's Storm's model, which is a philosophical approach and a systemic philosophy, and one that also engages with various forms of dialectical thought. And then you've also in your pieces, mentioned the work of Dumitrescu and others. So there is kind of a family of different conversations going on, and some of them are coming from different places. And I wanted to name all that because I think it's important, because some of these different strands will lean into different aspects of what it is that you're laying bare here, which is like, is this a trend in the arts, or is it something more like an episteme? And I think this is part of the conversation that is metamodernism as I'm thinking about it.
Yes.
So I wanted to say all that. But then within that, I have kind of my own notions of what this is. And I think that what you said just a minute ago about postmodernism is kind of exemplary in this sense because with postmodernism you see it emerge in the arts. I think it was Charles Jenks was talking about postmodern architecture, right? And there was some initial notions of kind of this postmodern kind of artistic zeitgeist, you could say. And then this kind of gets picked up by people in academia and philosophers and critical theorists and these kinds of folks who are then expanding that term, but to encompass more kind of systemic structural aspects of society after the modern. And so already you've got, yeah, this sort of enlargement going on of a term. Now the question then is like, is that a legitimate move or not? And by the time I think you get to people like Jameson or Harvey who are talking about the condition of postmodernity or, postmodernism as a cultural logic, they are doing a kind of broad cultural level analysis deeply infused with kind of Marxist, presuppositions around base and economic, superstructure, all these kinds of things, economic base and the cultural superstructure. And so that is, you go from the arts and then it winds up being employed across a whole series of fields and disciplines to talk about a kind of broader gestalt. Now, I would argue something similar is happening with the term metamodernism, that it shows up in the arts, it shows up in cultural studies of people talking about art, and then that proceeds to get expanded into a more comprehensive scope of analysis. I think this is where a lot of the different strands kind of see tension with each other because the cultural studies people are still just wanting to do art analysis, basically, and they're like, hey, this is just they're thinking about it more as a trend in the arts, more like a neoclassicism, right? But then the question is, well, is it that, or is it part of a broader gestalt that can you actually see what's happening in the arts as symptomatic of or otherwise reflective of things happening in other parts of culture? And even to their credit, the cultural studies people, aren't just limited to art. They can talk about politics in this way and other aspects of quote unquote cultural production. So there is a fairly more expansive sense there, but it's still a sense that like this is in the same way that, yeah, like different kind of sensibilities shift into each other. I think that they're looking at it from more of that limited, narrow focus. Then you get
But
the
I thought
hunt.
Vermeulen and Van den Akker would have been more. I get that with Dumitrescu, who
Mm.
would you would characterize as one of the cultural studies crowd, right?
Yeah, I think she fits most into that, but she's also in her own way kind of
She's a
like
bit of a free radical in her
yeah, a
own
bit
way.
of
She's
an
kind of got
outlier.
her own thing.
Yeah, sure.
But I thought Vermeulen and Van den Akker, they struck me as very much being part of a periodization scheme.
Hmm.
And maybe it was
Well,
you that brought this to my attention, but like that they were still very much I didn't sense that they were following on from the postmodern art theorists so much as they could sense that, oh, we can call this thing metamodern. Like they
yes.
knew it was bigger than merely this follows the
Yeah, yeah.
postmodern
No, no,
art.
that's true. But what I would say though is that they're looking at it. So, all right. You do have to kind of ultimately go back to Hegel with this, as you mentioned, right? Because from Hegel, then you get from his sort of idealistic dialectical idealism, right? Then you get the Marxian dialectical materialism, and then you've got this whole way of thinking about sort of movements of zeitgeists in terms of material reality. And of course, for Marx, that's an economic kind of modes of production are what are driving these big cultural shifts. And
Hmm.
and Vermeulen and von Daniker are broadly speaking in that tradition. I mean, in their works, they talk about, this is the logic of late, or what do they say, global capitalism. So they're linking this to some economic base as a kind of mode of production that gives, rise to a kind of superstructure. Now, I think that they're already dealing with some later Marxian thought, though, that's already, refined earlier kind of Marxist ways of thinking. And that is kind of the Raymond Williams stuff and the Jameson stuff, where it gets into this cultural logic. And all those folks are working, broadly speaking, in the field of sort of Marxist analysis of cultural shifts that is predicated on a kind of developmental logic of economic modes of production. I don't think that Vermeulen and von Daniker lean too heavily into that. They kind of it kind of shows up in their work, but if you read their analysis, they're not doing a whole lot of economic, reading of culture the way that like even David Harvey does. And like he's got chapters of graphs and moves from Fordist economy to a consumer, economy, all these kinds of things. They're not doing that sort of thing, even in the way that Jameson did. I think they're I mean, this would be in a sense a kind of critique of them, I suppose, from me, which is that they seem to be doing a kind of lip service to the kind of developmental logic that informs other kinds of Marxist analysis of cultural shifts, but they're not really hanging their hat there. And so I think that there is, I think again, also to your point, a lot of wishy-washiness to these notions of like, a sensibility, a structure of feeling, even a cultural logic. Like, what are these things? They seem to be more intuitive or suggestive than they are actually kind of, very defined things that we can talk about. And I think that that's a fair critique. Now I then try to get a better sense of what it is that we're actually meaning about these things, so it doesn't just hang out in a wishy-washy space. But I would say that, all that being said, the Vermeulen von Doniker folks are working in a kind of broadly Marxian framework
Mhm.
of kind of dialectical materialism light, but they don't really focus much on that. And I
Yeah, so
think,
I didn't want to
yeah.
like derail it too much with that, but it was just that I sensed that they weren't just limiting themselves to an aesthetic thing when they're talking about the pre-mod oscillating between the pre-modern and the modern and all these different sensibilities. I got the impression that it was more in that broad Marxist tradition of periodization rather than, hey, this is just about what's going on in the arts. I still thought they were taking on some of that Harvey, some of that Jameson
Yes.
cultural logic, a more global discourse than
Yes.
something quite
No,
conservative and
I
like this is just the arts.
I think that's right. But what's interesting though is that when I've gone to have conversations with folks in the cultural studies modern metamodernism camp, they don't that's not most of what gets talked about. Most of what gets talked
Mm.
about is, here's a work of art, let's read it through a metamodern lens, right? And we have now our ironic sincerity and our informed naivete, and now we can read the Barbie movie and we can read everything everywhere all at once, and these kinds of cultural artifacts in terms of metamodernism. And to some degree there is some reference to political movements and things like that, like Obama's kind of hopefulness gets talked about early in the initial paper. And even, I think, in a way that I disagree with, the authors also link kind of Trump to metamodern thoughts in terms of this post-truth thing. Anyway, so there are gestures into that broader domain, but if you try to, as I've attempted, to have conversations with the cultural studies folks about metamodernism as a kind of developmental phase, that's where they get really uncomfortable. And I think that a lot of that comes out of the critique that, ironically, the postmodern paradigm leveled against grand narratives, including Marxian narratives, right? And so there's a way that even kind of Marxist analysis runs afoul of kind of more quintessentially postmodern forms of analysis, because it would presume that there's a developmental logic unfolding in culture. I mean, that's what Marxist kind of, dialectics is about. Now, if you try to say to these cultural studies folks, hey, there's a developmental logic unfolding through culture and metamodernism is the spear point of that, ironically they get very uncomfortable and they're like, no, it's not developmental, it's and so there's
In which
there's
sense it's very wishy-washy because they're trying
yeah.
to have it both ways then.
Yes,
Because they're
I
trying
think
to
so.
say, hey, we're taking on the postmodern critique, so it's not a developmental thing, but we are also consciously aware that we're playing with mimetic gold. So we know that this has like a power as being the thing after postmodernism.
Yeah.
Even though postmodernism was kind of this idea of, hey, it's the end of like Baudrillard, it's kind of we're just hit fucking simulation from here on out. None of this is like there is nothing more.
Mm.
We're past it, and we're past the grand narratives in Lyotard's sense. So I just sense that that's a bit. Now, like what age were they? Were they 20, 23, 24 when they wrote this paper? It
Yeah,
was
probably late 20s, I would think.
so there. I imagine there was still a lot of vibes going on before. I know there were the years working on it afterwards, but I imagine at that early point, they hadn't thought that much through what they were
Well,
unleashing with the
what's
term.
frustrating to me, to be honest, is that I think it hasn't much progressed though since then in that cultural studies framing in terms of the theory of this, right? Like, yeah, if you
Mm.
want to talk about art analysis or even some political analysis using metamodernism as a framework or a rubric, talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and movies and art and stuff. Yeah, like people are churning that kind of stuff out. But in terms of like what is metamodernism and does it relate to some kind of Marxist dialectic of stages of modes of production or anything, like no one really gets to that. And to this day, regardless, I mean that paper came out in 2010, I think it was,
2009,
you know,
yeah,
so
yeah.
some over a decade ago. I other than their 2017 book, which I think does move the ball forward a little bit, there's not a whole lot of like real theoretical grappling with, let's say, a theory of cultural change. If not, if we're not going to use the word development or evolution, just a theory of
Yeah,
cultural change is not strongly foregrounded in this would be my critique. And I think you're picking up on
yeah.
that. And I think that that's a good, aspect
Which
to
is
then be concerned about.
Yeah, so that's why in that first critique I was saying, hey, they should have called it neo-Ironism and there'd be none of this confusion about
Yeah.
periodization. If we're talking about the characterization, which I'm pretty sure was the main thing, I think it was the Metamodern Manifesto, like Luke Turner's thing, where the pragmatic idealism and the other ideas showed up, but they were more about ironic sincerity, right? So that it's if they're talking about a new way that irony is being used, then and I know ironism wasn't a thing, but like irony was considered like this hallmark of
Sure.
the postmodern cultural sensibility. So call it post-ironism, and then it's like the Baroque, it's like neoclassical, and we don't have to have any of those
Yeah.
conversations. We've kind of delimited it to the aesthetic domain, and we're kind of like we're happy. But
Yeah.
then what I think happened was you had them trying to do this thing of
Uh-huh.
like they're kind of doing that, and then you had the integral crowd
Yeah.
kind of been like, hey,
Yeah,
look
right.
at this.
So this brings it into some other, engagement. So yeah, so I'm totally tracking with you, and I totally agree. And I think that that is a genuine, a good critique to level at the cultural studies version of metamodernism. I'd love it if, Vermeulen, von Daniker, even, Greg Dember, Linda Ciarello, if they are willing to talk to me, I'd love to get into this with them.
Yeah.
So I'm tracking with you there. But then, right, now we've got not just that, we've got multiple strands of this discourse of people meaning something different by metamodernism in terms of its theoretical categorization, right? So I would agree. We got cultural studies people kind of basically talking about trend art sensibility stuff and yet kind of using the language of dialectical materialism a little bit too loosely, and that leads to confusion. But then you got the Hansi Freinacht stuff, who's like, nope, we're going all in on the dialectics here, and we're going to do full on developmental logic of culture. And that now has created a kind of schism or a difference of opinion between the kind of metamodernism as informed by Hansi Freinacht and the cultural studies people. And of course, as you say, the Hansi Freinacht stuff is an outgrowth of integral philosophy. And so then you've got this aspect of the metamodern discourse where, well, talk about that because I think you described this phenomenon pretty accurately, for good or
Yeah, I
ill.
mean, the way I framed it was as they got cuckolded. Like the cuckoo came in with it saw a nice nest. The integral movement was basically dead. It sees this nice little nest of metamodernism, which fits so well with the periodization scheme that Ken Wilber was working with and the integral subculture we're working with. And it's like, hey, our movement might be like this seems like a new way of, and we can sandwich those things together because it's about taking more perspective. So we've got our overlap and we can bridge this. And then I feel like that kind of took over, and with that comes a lot of the just what there's so much that's problematic that comes with that developmental thing. I think that gets
Mhm.
snuck in with it, and yeah, not wanting to jump too far ahead. Yeah, I don't know how far ahead you want to go with this because I think I might be bleeding critiques here and I might
No,
jump
no.
too
Well, I
far.
mean, as you say, they're all these critiques are related, but let's start with that just for a second, which is, yeah, I think that to varying degrees of explicitness, the Hansi Freinacht books, I mean, they use the term, they shanghaied the term metamodernism and then kind
Yeah.
of gave it this other, enhanced framework and basically integrated it with, the kinds of developmental thinking that they'd gotten from integral theory, but used it as sort of a label under or a banner under which they could present a refined, revised developmental theory of culture that breaks with Wilber and integral theory and kind of present metamodernism in those terms. And so it's through that strand of the discourse that the developmental aspect, which again, I want to say has always been latent there and implicit because of it emerging out
Mhm.
of,
Yeah, I
dialectical
agree with that.
materialism, it gets foregrounded and in a way that I think is both, I think, justified for the cultural studies people to be like, hey, wait a second, this is different. But it's also a little bit weird for them to say that's no good, because I think, as we were just saying a minute ago, all of that was there implicit in the kinds of framework that supposedly they were using, the cultural studies people, to talk about metamodernism. But then arguably the Hansi Freinacht stuff just amps that up to 11. And then, do you see what I'm saying? Like, there's a, yeah.
Yes, I think it took we'll say the Mott and Bailey
Yes.
of the metamodern thing of like, oh no, we're just
Yeah.
using this as an aesthetic term, whereas the Bailey's like, hey, we get to play with that Marxian thing, and we know the power of that idea of a
Mm,
new age as a mimetic thing. So we know what we're doing. It's got an emotional charge
hmm.
that something like post-Ironism wouldn't have.
Sure.
So it's taking that, it's saying, hey, we're gonna take what you've abandoned down here and we're gonna make this the
Yes.
thing. So we're
Yes.
gonna build, like, we've already got something that fits here.
Yeah.
So you can go back to your mat. We're gonna stick with the Bailey. If
Yes.
I'm understanding my medieval
I
settlements
think
right,
it's
I'm
the
pretty
other
sure.
way. The Bailey is the castle. All right, but yes, I totally
Yeah.
agree with that. I think that's a really good way of talking about that. And then we can debate the pros and cons, the merits and demerits of an explicitly developmental framing of metamodernism, which I think is what you get into in your second or third essay. So
Yeah.
let's go there if you want, of like unpacking that.
Yeah, let me see that I have anything else there on that. On the first one.
And we can cycle back, as
Yeah,
you
no,
say
that's
there.
that's that's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think with the next one I get into talking about your decentration. And so that's what we get into. Yeah. So I'm kind of after reading your book and I was doing a talk on metamodernism in Ireland, and then that was where I loved your book, but something afterwards I was like, I don't know, this what is that doesn't sit right with me? And so digging down into the decentration idea and the idea that as a meta modern, you have access somehow, you've transcended and included all these previous levels. So the postmodern, the modern, well, we'll lump all the pre-moderns into one. So not only that it's a direct lineage of transcend and include, which we can talk about in the next critique, but that it somehow has access to what went before. And that seems absurd to me because yeah, it's just how can you possibly have access to a pre-modern worldview
Yeah.
just because it's further on in the developmental scheme? Like we don't think we have access to our early mammalian ancestor, to what was that
Right.
thing that was running through the trees. We don't have access to that because just because you evolved from something doesn't mean you have access to it. So
Yeah.
that was something that I wrestled with in that, and there's a level of hubris that comes with it, I think, because then you assume that you understand the other person's point of view because you've been there and you have already transcended and included
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
And so it takes away the humility of having to really, the hard work of having to understand someone else's point of view.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot there. There's at least two things I would separate. The hubris thing we can come back to, but I want to
Yeah,
get
yeah.
into the theory of, or the legitimacy of seeing this kind of, movement in general. And I also, in doing that, I would want to make a couple of distinctions. Because you mentioned, you came to the Hansi Freinacht stuff through Wilbur, and so I think followed more the standard approach for a lot of people, certainly in the online space, of when they come to metamodernism, it's often through integral theory. And this is interesting to me because I think it really does color how one approaches metamodernism as a term. Because I didn't have that experience. I came through the cultural studies thing, and then I discovered
Mm,
Hansi, and then I discovered Wilbur. So I kind of did reverse to other people. And so because of that, there was a way in which I was seeing, I could kind of track the convergences and divergences between Hansi's stuff and the metamodernism I was already familiar with. And there seemed to be meaningful enough continuity and discontinuity there that I could see, yeah, we're talking about this thing, and this is approaching it from a slightly different angle and giving it a new kind of developmental thrust. But as I got into the developmental thinking, that opened up this whole new world of thinking about cultural evolution in general, which then led me not just to Wilbur, but then through Wilbur into Habermas and into Hegel and into Marx. So you're actually, once you get into this broader tradition, you see that it's been going on at least since Hegel, right? In the way that we were
mhm.
talking about. Um, and so I do think that there's a little bit of confusion for a lot of people around metamodernism in the sense of coming through integral theory, because for a lot of people still, metamodernism just means Hansi Freinacht's work. And I think that that's problematic. So one of the things too that I really, where I'm coming at this from, is I see value in these different approaches to metamodernism, including Hansi's, but I also don't think that any one of them has the whole picture to this. I think that they're all kind of touching an aspect of it, and I try to get at that in my book. But that includes Hansi's framing. I find Hansi and Wilbur their stage models to be incomplete and imperfect, to say the least. And so, however, though, I do see great merit in thinking in broadly developmental terms to talk about cultural evolution. So I'm really interested in the way that we can try to make sense of metamodernism in developmental terms that can draw from the insights of, Marxist theory, from dialectics, from, Habermas and communicative action, and from Wilbur and from Hansi and all this stuff. I think that there's something there. But all that being said, I share your critique of a lot of these simplistic stage models. I think that there's a lot of problems with the way people have talked about this, and specifically in Wilberian integral terms. I think that what comes across there is a helpful gestalt, but I think it's too simplistic. He's a great popularizer of a certain kind of way of thinking about things. But when you dig into a lot of the things he's suggesting, they tend to fall apart. And I think this transcendent include bit is a good example of that. Like, I don't have access to pre-modern consciousness in that sense. And to talk about pre-modern consciousness is to fuse a lot of things together in a way that ultimately leads to these kinds of confusions, right? So that all said, briefly, I want to do. I also don't want. I feel like I talk too much because I'm trying to respond to all
No,
these
this
very
is good
complex.
because
Okay,
I've written the critique, so I feel
okay.
like I'm happy to.
So one of the things that I would posit as a more successful theory of developmental cultural evolution is thinking in terms of structures. So while Wilbur and some other folks do this, I think they often very easily slip their terminologies, and it gets very slippery. And then a word like, concrete operational can stand in for pre-modern, or it can stand in for mythic, and all these different things that are actually different get elided and conflated. And then it's like when you kind of move around your terms that way, eventually you're going to find, well, wait a second, that doesn't work. And this, because for
Mhm.
example, I might have access to Piagetian style concrete operations, right? I can think at that level of complexity, and maybe I can also jump up to formal operational levels of thought. Those are modalities that are available to my consciousness. Now, those are structures of ways of thinking. Now, if you want to make a structural analysis of pre-modern culture that suggests that pre-modern culture was predominantly characterized by concrete operational thought, then you've made an analogy, but you haven't made a kind of simplistic unity or identity, right? It's like I might be able to toggle between formal operational and concrete operational, but that doesn't mean I can toggle between modernity and pre-modernity, right? Because these are different things, but there's structure and then there's content, and how that relates in historical progressions of ideas. You've got a bunch of things in the mix together. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes in with the integral stuff, because it just smushes all these things together, and it talks about structures of consciousness. And then because, pre-modernity had its structure of consciousness, and we're relating that to the ontogenetic development, we're just going to say that we have access to that, but we don't, to your point. So I
Yeah.
think we can tease this apart better and be more accurate and more clear in what it is that we're actually talking about.
So when it
And
comes to
yeah.
decentration, do you see that as the structural thing? So like we'll say the model of hierarchical complexity. Yes, I've got access to concrete operation or level 8 or level 9 or whatever. Do you see it as that, as I've got access to these things rather than that I have access to the pre-modern level or the Faustian level or whatever levels, using the different names?
Yeah, well, what I would say, and here I think Wilbur can be helpful because he's got his quadrants, right? And so you can see that there's a shared pattern or structure that might unfold in the different quadrants. So
Mhm.
if I have the upper left, which is the individual, interior, I might be able to toggle between concrete and formal operational thinking, and that is a decentration move at the level of cognition, you could say, right? And people like Robert Keegan have done a really good, job talking about ego development in those terms, and then you can map that to the model of hierarchical complexity, and all that's in the upper left quadrant, right? But then you also have those other quadrants. So, like maybe down the lower left, you're talking about worldviews, and worldviews might be able to do an analogous sort of structural move, but that doesn't mean it's the same move, right? So what I would suggest is something like that, where if you're trying to do forms of cultural analysis, you can look at the way in which succeeding periods reflect on what came before and therefore decenter from them and move beyond them. But we shouldn't conflate that with what happens in individual ontogenetic consciousness.
So you don't have access to those lower levels on that cultural level. Because I think, so you mentioned the ontogenetic thing. I think a lot of this is the ontogeny or
Yeah,
phylogeny recapitulates
yeah,
ontogeny
right.
thing. This idea that the cultural level is just a what do you call it? Not an analogy, a match to the
Yeah,
internal
right.
level of
And I think
people.
that's
Whereas,
wrong.
yeah, okay, so yeah, that's
And I mean, I was just reading Wilbur. I picked up a Post-Truth World, which
mm,
is his penultimate. It was the one before his most recent, I think. And he makes this move, and I think it's a very misguided move where he's like, we all move through the mythic stage, or we all move through the magic stage, we all move through the mythic stage, and it's like that's not quite right, right? Because what's being confused there is and then here this does become a bit complex because I do think fundamentally that uh, we can understand move, and this is a broader point which I'll unpack later on. But I do think we can understand cultural evolution in terms of developments into broadly higher, more complex forms of thought. What do I mean by that? I mean, and this is actually research that I'm doing at the moment that you can actually empirically show, this in a sense to be the case, which this will be coming out in a bit. But
mm,
broadly speaking, there are meaningful correlations between, you could call them cultural epochs, you could call them historical time periods. But when you look at the structure of thinking that is evidenced during these different periods of time, they will skew towards particular levels of hierarchical complexity, right? So, like my research is showing that if you look at materials from a forager society, you're looking at around lexical level 9, late 8. If you look at early mythic societies and look at like the Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff like that, you're looking at like early 10. And I do think that there are meaningful ways in which cognition and culture relate, that the psyche and society are in a dialectical relationship with one another. And I think that is that can be done. That kind of theorization can be done responsibly and very coherently and clearly. And I think people like Jürgen Wren are doing a great job with that. And Habermas has done a great job with that.
yeah.
But that's a claim, and that's a particular way of seeing things. But that's different from saying that, let's say, lexical level 9 is the magic stage. Like that is not.
Mm.
Then you're confusing structure and content, right? Hierarchical complexity is just a matter of like recursive abstractions and what we can build off of recursively complexifying levels of mental schema being coordinated with each other. Now, the content that takes will be different depending on whether or not you're living in the 21st century or the first century, and how that relates then to broad historical epochs. It's not as simple as just saying this is the magic stage and this is the mythic stage. That's a confusion of the ontogenetic and the phylogenetic in a way that then leads to these kinds of unfortunate situations. The last thing I'll say about that is that, all that said, I think that if we do a properly integrative analysis, we can appreciate that there are interweaving dialectical feedback relationships between individuals and their collective societies, and that these do undergo complexification, and that metamodernism can be positioned as a part of that process. And so I think all of that remains to be let's say argued or debated or
Yeah.
proven or whatever.
Because I still don't know that that sits right. Like I
Sure.
can see it up to the Bronze Age,
Hmm.
and I can see that point. But from the Axial Age onwards,
Yes.
I'm not sure that I see a leap. And even if you look at Julian Jaynes, like the bicameral mind, like even in a lot of these meta theorists,
Yeah.
that was the chasm that was crossed.
No,
And
I,
from
I
the
think you're
Axial Age
right.
onwards.
I think you're right. And I think that, I mean, so again, I haven't gotten there in my research yet, but I think what it will show is something like what you're talking about. I think when you get into the axial age, you're basically already at like lectical 11 and the same kinds of structures of thinking that someone like a Robert Keegan would say would be necessary to engage in sort of the
Yeah.
expectations of the modern world. Now, so I think we are at a point where we need to rethink our maps of these things. And what I wanted to say about that is this is really interesting then, because what we can show with this is that maybe we are seeing the structural level at the upper left quadrant of individual ontogenetic interior development getting to a certain level. But if there's not the corresponding lower right systemic or lower left, worldview level kind of system in which these things are going to move ahead, then they're going to stay in a different mode. So, for example, in the axial age, I think if you look at what the level of thought that Plato, for example, is engaging, it's the same level of thought you could say that characterizes kind of fourth order consciousness in Keegan's sense, in the sense of like the structure of consciousness we associate with modernity. But what modernity has that the axial age didn't is industrialization and a
Which
kind of
and again, I'm sympathetic to the Marxian base.
yeah,
The idea that the base, in Marxist terms, determines, so like sets the limits
yeah,
to what the culture can be,
right,
to what the ontogenetic development could be, you
yeah,
could argue. So I think that idea of the economic base, but it's still, as you were talking, and I was thinking, okay, well, why the Bronze Age? Because the Bronze Age arguably had just as much complexity as the Axial Age at a certain point. In certain places, there was
mm,
international trade, yeah,
hmm,
international trade, and there was sophisticated society. So with that, what I'm about to say doesn't make sense. But what I think is that with Rome, the level of complexity in Rome, and this is a point that I see about this whole argument in general, and something I have the problem with Wilbur and this idea
hmm,
of stages of history is that
yeah,
it's more about complexity and density, and the amount of nodes in a network
mm,
increases the amount of complexity you have to process. So with Rome, you get an incredible density, and we'll say the Roman era, so like the international um, nations in we say Egypt, North Africa, Carthage, and in the east, they have a level of complexity that their base supports a high population density, which leads to much more complexity
yeah,
because there's many more nodes in the network, and the more nodes there are in the network, and the more you have to think about that, the more you have to fold those levels over and over, and your thinking has to abstract more. So the
yeah,
base causes you to increase your ontogenetic
yeah,
complexity. So
yes,
the base still causes that. Why wouldn't it cause it in the Bronze Age is what I'm thinking in what you're saying there. But I still think that then Rome reaches a higher level on the spiral than you see for another, would say, I mean, like until the 12th century Renaissance, so
yeah,
probably the 1100s realistically. I mean, bit of a spike at the Carolingian Renaissance, but
hmm,
really nothing there until the 12th century Renaissance, which, well, I mean, you could look at the Islamic society and that incredibly sophisticated, which gifted us our entire culture in the 12th century, and the European university tradition being born out of that. So it's the complexity that leads to the increase in the spiral, and the spiral can decrease. It's not this
yeah,
constant
yes.
linear uptake.
Right. I mean,
And
the collapse of Rome set that kind of cultural developmental process back basically 1,000 years. And you can look at that even
in
quantitatively.
Western Europe,
In Western Europe, correct. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, this is also, well, I shouldn't say obviously, because this mistake is made a lot too, but this is context specific, right? So there isn't a global system, arguably, until, at least and even now, it's not fully globalized in the degree that it could be. But like we're talking about where social structural conditions create this kind of complexity that you're describing. And so that is historically contingent and it's different across different places in the world. And this is then a great way of understanding why um, the let's say cultural logic of different places is different at different times as well, right? One of the critiques of kind of simplistic periodization schemas is that they try to just superimpose onto everything like, oh, now we live in a metamodern world, right? And it's like, well, no, we don't. Some things are metamodern or some things are postmodern, some things are modern. But that's because you're talking about the kind of emergent aspects of cultural sensibilities that come from different degrees of cultural complexity in different places at different times. And that is a process that shouldn't just be, painted with one brush, if that makes sense. And so
Mm.
these kinds of approaches that can look at these processes, at this kind of integrative level of seeing, okay, there's this kind of social complexity that you're talking about, but then that social complexity necessarily places demands on the cognitive complexity of the members of its society. So then there's increasing cognitive complexity, and that this becomes a dialectical feedback process, right? So that these things, while different, are also related. I think that different but also related is where all the hangups come from, because people at varying degrees of complexity in their thought about this process will conflate different aspects of it with one another, and then they'll say, "Oh, okay, you're green or you're red or whatever," as though this is some,
Mm.
simplistic, holistic thing that can be reduced to some single thing. Where it's like, no, what we're talking about is, biopsychosocial cultural complexity across, these different aspects of collectivity and individuality that are all engaged in a very complex feedback loop with each other. And then to that point, one of the things that I think is really crucial here is to understand how these things relate, so that, and again, I highly recommend The Evolution of Knowledge by Jürgen Renn, because he gets at this, but so does Habermas, that what we do is we materialize our thought, right? So that you don't just have an idea, you create a tool, and that we have these paper tools, you could say, and that could be mathematics, and it can be ideas, like communism or socialism or liberalism, whatever. These are themselves material aspects of culture that get deposited into, kind of, you could say, the lower right aspect of society, and that creates a kind of motor or drive that then places new demands on the upper left of the cognitive complexity of people to be able to live with. And I think, again, Robert Kegan's work is excellent for this, because when you live in a modern world, there's a kind of hidden curriculum, as he calls it, that's being imposed on your cognitive complexity to be able to navigate living, as a professional who's also a mother, who's also, having to navigate the IRS and having to, the system in which you live places demands on your cognition, and that has a kind of ratcheting effect. And especially how this relates then to the institutions where these cultural knowledge deposits are, and what serve the kind of enculturation process. All that's going to lead to this kind of ongoing motor of cultural complexification until it doesn't, right? Until
Mhm.
Rome collapses, until a plague or something, right? But we have to separate out those different aspects. And when we do, I think we're in good terrain to be able to make sense of the idea that there is a relationship between cognitive and cultural complexity and social complexity, but they're in a very entangled, complex knot. And most of the problems that come with simplistic stage models come from people not being able to properly parse out which aspect of that knot they're actually talking about. And they just treat it as one lump thing. And then they say you're at a stage, or, this is higher and this is lower. And yeah.
Yes. So where are you on the idea that there are these linear stages? Because that's what that was the third critique, where
Yeah.
I this idea that you transcend and include each level and move up. I'm just like, that is not intuitively true at
Right.
all, from what you
Yeah.
see out there.
I mean, what I would say is that there is a linearity to the model of hierarchical complexity, for example, right?
Yeah.
Now, that is a complexification process that unfolds in human minds and unfolds by means of recursively coordinating different mental content to be able to deal with higher level abstractions. That is a linear process, and I think that some things in different cultures are going to require different levels of hierarchical complexity to deal with. Right? So, like, if you're just talking about a mythic story of trying to explain something, then that will make fewer demands on abstraction and, a complexity of thought than will trying to appreciate, how atoms, relate in fields of, electromagnetism, all this stuff, right? I think that different accounts and justification systems that we build up place different kinds of demands on our cognitive complexity, and those will become normative in different contexts. So anyway, I would say that there's a relationship, but it's not a direct relationship. I feel like knowledge systems do evolve, and they do evolve in terms of complexity, but that is a social as well as a cultural as well as an individual complexification process.
So
So,
you're breaking down that direct link between that,
right,
as if all of our biases, all of
right,
our
right, right.
other beliefs and world, all the other elements that make up the soup of a human
Yeah,
have nothing to do with it. It's just, hey, look at this
yeah,
beanpole of like development, and we can just stick our cultural levels here like
yeah,
baubles on a Christmas tree. It just doesn't really make sense, and you have your nice, neat little spiral, and it's bizarre when you get down to it. But
yeah,
I still don't think I'm understanding what you're proposing then, because you're still saying there's a difference between structure and content. So there's the model of hierarchical complexity. There's a degree that's kind of like we'll say the upper left version of Marx's base. You know,
mm,
it's saying
hmm,
this puts a limit on how complex a society can be. And Marx's base kind of puts its own
yeah,
determining limits.
yeah,
But what then is your conception of like these models, this developmental spiral, decentration? Like how do these things relate?
yeah.
Because I'm not sure. Because with the book with decentration, it seemed like I don't know whether you were just kind of coming up with a way to formulate the way we'll say
Yeah.
Hansi or the like of that we're thinking, or whether that's something that you're talking about that I'm missing there.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I would say a couple things. One is, yes, in the book treatment of this, in the metamodernism book treatment of this, I've got just a few pages really where I'm trying to just offer a basic structure through which we can then read the different forms of metamodernism. And I think that that's really just what I'm trying to offer there. I'm not really trying to get into a holistic theory of cultural evolution. I'm doing that now in my current work, so stay tuned. I'm very systematically going through, all right, here's cognitive complexity and here's, societal level learning structures and how do those relate to each other and all that. So I am doing that kind of work, but I'm not doing that in that book. So
So in that book, you were more trying to here, can we get a way to tell a story that where all of these
yeah,
different metamodern trends fit
exactly.
together?
Yeah,
Okay.
basically. I mean, there I was just trying to say you had people saying, look, people are using this word metamodernism, but it means very different things. And there's no connection. Again, as we were talking about a minute ago, the cultural studies people, want to talk about art and politics and stuff, but then when the developmental people start talking about it, they're like, no, 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 that's something totally different. And then I'm like, no, they're not. There might be different emphases, they might be different kind of how much of that aspect of the developmental logic is being presumed or foregrounded versus others, but they're both presuming something. And then when you get something like Storm and the other stuff, they all seem to be presuming a certain kind of thing, which is that metamodernism is coming after postmodernism, but it is moving through and by means of postmodernism. So there's some sense in which it has taken aspects of postmodernism, but carried them through and changed them in a particular way such that it contains those things, but it isn't to be kind of, reduced to those things. And that to me is a move that they're all making, which is a developmental kind of logic. It's
Which
basically
is
a
a move I
dialectical logic.
fundamentally disagree with as well, because
Yeah.
again, coming out of Wilbur, it's there's this stench of that anti-woke kind of idea. And obviously
Yeah.
this goes back way before woke. He called it boomeritis back in the day,
Right.
and it's hilarious to think of it as being called that now. But this idea of the postmodern, the mean green meme as he calls it, the
Hmm.
this postmodern idea, and it's just such a
Caricature.
like a Red Scare caricature. It's
Yeah.
just these postmodernists, and this is what. But like, n- did any of them identify as post? And this was something that the Plastic Pills podcast they
Yeah.
were kind of drilling down on. It's probably one of the only people that actually identifies as a postmodernist, and he's like, this is not postmodernism, and that's with Storm, who would be one of the better
Yeah.
read, I imagine, or the better at this, and still, if no one identifies with that term or no one have you heard of the ideological Turing test, the idea that like you should be able to get what you're saying, we'll say with postmodernism, you
Hmm.
should be able to describe postmodernism in such a way that a postmodernist would agree that you are what they're talking about.
Hmm.
Otherwise you're just
Yeah.
otherwise you've created a boogeyman from the outside, or you've created a
Sure.
caricature from the outside and you think that this is lifelike, but actually there's no blood flowing in this
Yeah.
thing. You've just created it, and now we tell a story about it, but there's no one on the other side of that. There's
Right.
no postmodernists that are saying this is what postmodern theory is. And then the point that they bring up is that like, hey, this is kind of drawing on the critics of postmodernism to characterize
Yeah.
them. And then Storm is also saying that this isn't about the postmodern thinkers themselves. That is the good
Yeah.
move that he makes. It's more their followers. But then at that point, it's like I remember being annoyed when Channel 4, after the Kathy Newman and Jordan Peterson interview, when they were
Mm.
like, well, Jordan Peterson's a bad guy because Kathy Newman's getting death threats from
Yeah.
some of his supporters. And like, well, you can't reduce someone to their followers.
Yeah.
Now, luckily, over time, Jordan Peterson has lowered himself to the level of his followers, but or my personal opinion anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, that kind of
No, I
he's
hear you.
another he's another person that rails on postmodernists and is getting it from Hicks. And I saw
Yeah.
that you interviewed Hicks, and it's this strain of like
Yeah.
this straw manning of postmodernism is kind of fundamental to this
Yeah.
metamodern. If okay, they might not all share the developmental thing, and I don't think the cultural theory crowd necessarily share this thing, but the rest have this idea of postmodernism. That where is it? Like,
Yeah.
where does this postmodernism exist? And because is it a developmental level? Is it the
Right.
green
Well,
bean?
there's
Like, what is
all
it?
right. Yeah. So there's a couple things there, and one, this gets back to what is this not is postmodernism as a category, but what sort of category is it? Right. I mean, so a part of this is still lingering on that aspect of the confusion that when people use a word like postmodernism, they're meaning different things. And then there's a lot of semantic slippage. And then we wind up kind of talking past each other. And so, but there was a lot to what you just said that I'd want to unpack, though. I mean, I broadly agree with it. The only part I might make a distinction, though, is that um, I think that we can do meaningful analysis of phenomena without having to frame it in an emic term, right? There's emic and etic ways of talking about, like, emic is from within and etic is sort of like an
Right. Yeah.
outsider perspective. Like, I don't think that anthropologists are wrong when they talk about, like a particular rain dance or something from a particular anthropological lens in a way that the practitioners themselves wouldn't necessarily see, right? I think that there
Mhm.
is actually a way of being able to talk about phenomena. Yeah. So this speaks to the idea of the ideological
I,
Turing test.
yeah, I can see what you're saying. That, yeah, just because you don't understand the meaning of a Christmas tree doesn't mean that there's thus no meaning to it. We can still speak about the symbolical meaning of it just because the individual
Right.
who holds that belief doesn't understand it. So it's,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I would even go further that, like, we should expect some element of that to be necessary of this sort of high level analysis. If you're actually doing analysis of culture, then what you're describing is not necessarily going to be immediately available to the consciousness of people who are undergoing that or practicing it or doing it, right? If you're doing a kind of, oh, this is society, then you're necessarily going to be drawing connections in a different kind of causal way than the sorts of people who are undergoing it. Otherwise, you're not really engaged in any kind of analysis. You're just sort of either describing things you're seeing, or you're just sort of speaking from an emic perspective, right? So, like,
But
for
what if you're
example,
also just drawing a category of things that don't belong together?
yeah,
Like
right,
a laptop, a cup, and a dog that's outside. How do I tell a story that these are in the same category in a way that they hold together? And
yeah,
that seems it seems like with the postmodern case there's been particular
yeah,
abuse done, especially like even just the idea that they don't believe in reality or that they're relativists. And Derrida is, as they say on that, at the Plastic Pill say in that podcast, it's like he is definitively and explicitly not an anti-realist.
hmm,
And yet, how is this such a core
yeah,
element of the discourse about Derrida? It's this boogeyman being created, and it's like, if the rigor is so lacking here, then how can you build something as an idea of post this,
yeah.
except as a rhetorical move to slam it?
I
Because you're not
yeah,
being accurate to the meaning of the term from the outside, so you're not actually doing a good anthropological job.
yeah,
It's more like Fraser talking about savages in the 19th century
right,
rather than an anthropologist now with a bit more cultural
right.
sensitivity, being able to understand from the inside their perspective and then bring in the outside perspective. It seems like this is just Fraser's golden bough where we're like, look at the savages.
Yeah.
And that's a bit weaker.
Totally. No, I think that that is a legitimate critique, and it's certainly, if not, I mean, there's certainly versions of that happening. I think that there are strong versions that are also, that don't fall for that trap. And I do think that Storm, despite what the plastic pills people said, isn't. I think he's being very clear. I think that, and here's his approach, which I think is a very justified one. And I would also say I think Storm is the most explicit about what he means by postmodernism, right? I think part of what you're describing as there's a challenge of, what's the logic of what we link together? This cup, this table, like I want to tell a story. How do I justify linking these things together? That's a good question. It's easier to do when I'm trying to talk about something like this room because I can point to things. And if I point out the window and I say, and that tree's part of this room, you can be like, well, but what? And then you're like, well, I'm standing here and I see it from in the room. You can make a case. But the point
Yeah.
is, it's a lot easier to do with something, concrete, specific, and immediate. If you're talking about something like postmodernism or some cultural phase that's supposed to be impacting across levels of systems and culture and people's cognition, this is such a broad category that it's, I think, necessarily going to be difficult to make the kind of categorical bounds, like immediately defensible. Now, to his credit, there's two things here. Storm both acknowledges that aspect and has a notion of process social kinds, right? These are difficult things that lead to a deconstruction in postmodern thought when we go to do analyses of culture or anything else, because you can always poke holes and say, hey, well, why this and what about this? And this is an outlier and these sorts of things. And then categories break down. But what we're looking for are particular property clusters that have anchoring conditions that we can speak to. And then you have to then do the work of establishing what are those anchoring conditions. And I think Storm does all that pretty well. I think also he is the most explicit, as I was saying, about what he means by postmodernism, which isn't just some amorphous zeitgeist, and it's not just some, people having ideological views in this direction or that direction. He refers to it as a paradigm in a Kuhnian sense, right? So he's talking about how has postmodernism been anthologized and deployed as a research paradigm in academia. That's his target. And for that, yes, he's going to look at anthologies. He's going to look at how people like Derrida were not just communicating their ideas, but how they were received, which is where the whole followers bit comes in. Because as he says, like Derrida didn't necessarily hold this position. Maybe Foucault didn't hold this position that's being supposed of them. But if you go to the academy and you're expected to do certain kinds of work, you're going to be doing certain kinds of work in a quote unquote postmodern paradigm that is the descendant of the textbookification of quote unquote postmodernism as it was reconstructed by Anglophone philosophers in the academy in the 20th century.
Yeah.
That's what he's getting at. Now you can critique that as being, is that a good category or
But
not?
that's
But
such
yeah.
an amorphous, like, that's a very, very hard thing to pin down, and it's not necessarily clear that it should be called postmodernism.
No, that's fair. To the second point I'll come to in a second. The first point, he has a footnote in there where he's got many, many, many texts that he's explicitly drawing our attention to be like, this is what I'm talking about. He calls it the mother of all footnotes, right? Where he's in his chapter on the deconstruction dojo. He's like, this is what deconstruction looks like. And it's a bunch of authors doing these moves. So it's also not just is postmodernism in the room with us right now sort of a move. It's no, like, look at these very influential thinkers from across the academy in the last 20, 30 years. Here's a bunch of them doing this.
Yeah.
As for whether or not we should call that postmodernism, that's a good question. Like, I mean, that is open to debate. I think that there's good reason why we should, but I guess I'd ask you, is there a reason why we shouldn't?
So it seems like it just seems like an inherently useless term. Not useless. That's overstating it. It seems like it was a term that took off. I mean, is it the connection with deconstruction that makes us call this postmodernism? But then Derrida never identified as a postmodernist. So should we call it? Just seems like it's a term that's been much more used pejoratively
Yeah,
than charitably.
sure.
And so I'm not sure that you will get anyone being like, I think that guy in Plastic Pills ironically says, I'm a postmodernist.
Uh-huh.
If such a thing exists, I'm a postmodernist.
Yeah,
But there's that big question mark over, is this a category that anyone identifies as fitting in?
right.
And then if we're using this term postmodern, well, then that seems to have been a rather soiled term that's more or less used by as an outgroup term.
I think that's a
As
very fair point. And then I guess the question would be, all right, if we're going to dispatch with that term because it's used predominantly pejoratively, You could at least make that claim. How do we gesture to this cluster of properties that we see that both has a characteristic of being an academic paradigm as well as arguably unfolding in broader popular culture in terms of various kinds of
Well, woke
ideological.
is a better, like, but
Mm,
still woke has kind of been turned into a pejorative term, but it at least started as I'm identifying as a woke
yeah,
person, which
yeah,
means that I'm social justice aware. I have these different traits about me, and then it was later weaponized.
yeah,
But so that's at least started as an in-group term.
yeah.
And so yeah, to find a better term, if there is such a thing as that paradigm, I know you're saying, but they're not like natives. They're not tribal natives dancing around a totem pole. You can ask these people and find out what their name is. You don't have to anthropologically say they can pass. You can pass an ideological Turing test with them. I
Yes,
think it's not
I,
such a struggle, and I think that that's something that should be strived for rather than. And this ties in with my whole thing about metamodernism, where there's an arrogance to assuming that you can tap into other people's perspectives. I know you're
mhm,
saying you don't agree with that, but with that decentration, the spiraling model, there's a sense that oh, we can tap into them. We know them
yeah,
better than they know themselves.
yeah,
There's that kind of an arrogance. But going back to Dumitrescu's tendency towards integration,
yeah,
or Peterson's Peacemaker article, which I think is a wonderful proto or just meta modern piece.
mhm,
That idea that hey, we actually have to reach out. There's work to be done to
yeah,
understand the other point of view, and that acknowledges that there is another point of view, and you're not just taking it for granted that you're at the top of the hierarchy. And
totally.
so, with the postmodern thing, it's so fundamental to the idea of a metamodernism because it
Mm,
needs to be that's what we're going through to come to the other side of. That's kind of axiomatic to the metamodern thing. And
yeah.
if there's no one out there that identifies as postmodern or agrees with the characterization of the postmodern, then that should be a major problem for
Okay, yeah. So
metamodernism.
here's what I would say that though is one is I think there's a difference between talking about these terms as ideological commitments that people would self-identify with versus as descriptive categories, right? Like, for example, postmodernism was a very meaningful term of analysis in the academy in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, right? Like you had an explosion of books, people talking about postmodernism. And I mean, arguably people like Jameson and Harvey they're not writing polemics against postmodernism. They're writing fairly descriptive treatments of it. And I remember at one point, Jameson, even in his book, says something like, "I like a lot of postmodern art." He's not even trying to like make some kind of a critique per se. I would say to the degree that a lot of them were Marxists, there is an implicit critique there. I think a lot of the time because they're seeing this stuff as expressions of late capitalism, and then there's this sense that it's a failure in that sense.
Yeah, I
But
see the group of theorists called postmodernists as more critiquing their time as being postmodern,
yeah,
as
yeah,
the traits of it as postmodern,
right.
rather than as identifying as postmodernists. And that's
Well,
the later thing that's come along.
yeah,
It's like here we're talking about the nature of this late stage capitalism
yeah,
as a sort of an adjacent thing to that postmodern category they were talking about.
yeah,
It was a critique of society that had gone into this postmodern end hole, and I see them more as prophets that are warning against what's happening rather
sure.
than being like, hey, I'm this new kid on the block and I'm doing this.
Yeah,
They're more critical of what's going on. And
yeah,
so there's a disjoint between calling them postmodernists versus
right.
what they're using postmodern. And there's loads of people that identify as metamodernism, and it's not as a pejorative term. It's
Yeah,
not as a
yeah,
critique of a society. It's an exuberant excitement for here's what's coming. So they're
yeah.
they're used completely differently by that group of thinkers and this group of people.
I hear that. And I think what you're saying about those early postmodern thinkers being critics of the kind of phenomena that they're describing rather than sort of triumphalist celebrators of it is a really important one. And I'll grant you that. I mean, there are people like Baudrillard who are like, I'm a nihilist, and all this sort of thing.
But
So
he's
some
kind of warning about it when he's talking about simulation.
Mhm.
He might say he's a nihilist, but there's a warning tone
Yeah,
to what he's talking about. It's
yeah.
it's not a rejoicing in it. It's not a Gen Z TikTok reel where or some kind of
It's
performative
right.
exuberance in that.
It's
There
not
is a a fear, and I apologize to all the Gen Z people watching. That was I was watching stuff about Gen Z this morning. It was about post irony. It's a different thing,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Well, I would just say what you're describing also is really interesting because it makes me think of the reception of Nietzsche, who the same thing happened, right? He's like, oh, God is dead, and people read that as some, triumphalist thing, but actually he was critiquing, and so the way
it's a
Nietzsche,
postmodern. That's a post. Like in my
yeah,
video on that, I said that's a postmodern sentiment. It's
mm,
not a modern celebration of like the new atheist God is
yeah,
dead. It's a postmodern warning of like, hey, we've got all these problems. We're falling into nothing. We're gonna have no way to orient ourselves.
yeah, yeah,
It's he is the first postmodernist, and you can see that in I think
yeah,
even Plastic Pills mentioned it in that thing or in a throwaway comment. I think they did because I've said that before that he is the first postmodernist, really, or maybe you could go back a little bit further, but he is
yeah.
warning about this end point of modernity rather than rejoicing in
Sure.
modernity.
I think that's a really good point, and I'd love to think more about that, lean more into that. And also, I'm really open to the idea of trying to find terms that aren't so ideologically loaded, right? That could be satisfactory from an emic perspective of people self-identifying with them.
Mm.
I think that that's a really important thing to be able to do. I do also, though, want to say that I think that there's also value in using terms descriptively to talk about certain clusters of ideas and that people don't have to self-identify with them. Because, like, if you were to look at Francis Bacon or Galileo or Newton, right? I think it'd be very hard to disagree with the notion that these people were core to what we now call modernity. That the rise of modernity, if you're going to tell that story, has to include some
Yeah,
mention, I
but see,
think.
this is the thing is that like that story, even that story is a good example
Mhm.
where this narrative of the Renaissance leading into the scientific, like the Renaissance was a joke. It was a load of painters who made no contributions to science. Copernicus shit was wacky, and like the idea that the church was against it. It's just this narrative of like church bad, religion bad, Renaissance happened, wonderful, science good. It's like no, there was the 12th century Renaissance in which the Islamic tradition through Avicenna and Averroes had passed us on a body of work, not just a body of work from the ancient Greeks, but a paradigm within
Mhm.
which they were developing that.
Yeah.
We had popes who died in their optics laboratories. We had scientists in the 12th century, and then you had a famine and then a plague in the 13th
Mm.
century. And then Petrarch was like, fuck science, let's get back to alchemy and humanism. And it was like, that's nice. And so we had a nice 100 years of painting, and Copernicus did his thing. And then we've got the story of Galileo as if he's some kind of great warrior. And it's like Galileo died because he was trying to do this theological shit rather than because of his scientific views. His scientific views were celebrated. He was brought to Rome. They fucking loved him. Everyone was fighting for him. And then it was like, hey, you're offending the Pope because you're using him insultingly in your dialogue. Okay, that's going to get you in trouble. So you've fallen out of favor. And now you're trying to do this theological work with some of your astronomical stuff. And that's where he gets in trouble because he's oversteps his bounds. Giordano Bruno, another joke. It's just there's this narrative of history that crushes down the nuance in order to create this story of like, we came out of the dark ages of religion when really Islam gave the Middle Ages, which built on the Carolingian Renaissance, into the 12th century Renaissance. Science was there. It went on pause until the start of the 16th or start of the 17th century when the scientific revolution took off. There's no major scientific contributions before the 17th century and 150 years earlier. So we've got this weird narrative, which, if you're using McGilchrist's lens, might work because the Renaissance, for all that I've said, was more of a right hemispheric time. So if that's what you prefer, Renaissance was great. But if you're looking for scientific progress and you talk about linear progress, already this use of like descriptive storytelling is just you're creating a map that is inaccurate and is useful for certain rhetorical purposes, but I think is does a disservice to actual history and to accuracy.
Well, I would say I'm all for trying to nuance our, historical
Sorry, yeah,
storytelling.
that rant was
No, no, it's fascinating. It's
a
interesting, but
complete aside.
you raised some points that I could agree with, and then you raised some things that I would just have to either question or look into. I mean, I would say that again, I'm all for um, not taking certainly simplistically linear notions of history. I think that that's misguided. Um, I'll say that and agree with it. And I do think the kinds of nuancing that you just did in terms of bringing in the Islamic traditions and the way that they carried over, Aristotle and the various Platonist thinkers and all that. Yes, great. And maybe we don't tell that part of the story enough. And so anyway, these kinds of various degrees of revisionism to kind of the classic notion of Western cultural history, I'm cool with. I'm not sure if I would say the Renaissance was a joke and that Galileo was just, I don't know, yeah, that
I'm being
specific aspect.
hyperbolic, but
I know, but
yeah. But
I'd be
still,
curious where
Galileo
some of
is
that came from.
perceived as dying for his science, but he didn't die for his science. He died for a rhetorical move, much like Columbus, like the story of Columbus and the
Yeah.
world. He's portrayed as this great heroic thing, and it's actually this guy died because he had kooky views.
Well, just as an
Uh,
aside, where are you getting that version of the story?
there's a great guy called Tim O'Neill who I initially went down that rabbit hole with, and then there's another book that I'm reading, Gods, and I forget the
Yeah.
term, but it's
Huh.
a video I'm working on the new year. But it's a guy who basically has gone in. Tim O'Neill is in a lot of Quora posts, and then he turned them into blog posts, but was basically just showing this entire notion. It's just bad history. So there's a subreddit called Bad History, and Tim O'Neill's quite
Okay.
popular there. That it's this standard historical narrative that we're given because it's very neat,
Mhm.
but like these philosophical or these scientific heroes of Galileo, Copernicus, and Giordano Bruno are should not be scientific
Well, I'll
heroes
agree
now.
with you on Bruno and Copernicus. I think Bruno was just a mystic that, happened to be right about some things and he fell afoul of the theology of his day. And Copernicus was also just kind of a Platonic, mystic sort of alchemical fellow
Yeah,
who,
again, just kind of got lucky
yeah,
in what he was right, but
yeah,
did actually help. They kept his calculations. The scientists at the time were like, okay, some of this is useful,
sure.
but your
Well, without
model
getting
doesn't.
into the nitty gritty, and which I am interested in that. And again, I think probably the Galileo bit I disagree with the most. But granting that we can eschew certain simplistic notions of history, let's just work with the presupposition that when we look out at the world today, it's very different than the way the world was in the first century AD, for example, right? Or if we want to make a broad distinction between just the modern world and what how things were like in 500 BCE. Um, I think that when we start with that level of granularity, just very coarse grain, you're like, oh yeah, these are rather different, right? Then we have
Hmm.
to start to try to account for how did this come to be? What are all these materials, these plastics that I see around me that didn't exist before a certain time, and how did they come to be? And what's the story that tells of you at least seem to gesture to being cool with the idea of a scientific revolution and an industrial revolution, these sorts of things. I think that there's a story there that relates to a history of ideas and cultural evolution that meaningfully, however we want to nuance and revise certain aspects of the kind of, caricatured version, as they should be, because we don't want a simplistic, silly, linear tale of everything led to progress, because that's a very kind of blindly modernist, I would say, view of it. But what I'm getting at is that there are meaningful clustered properties that are different that we want to try to account for and see what their different anchoring processes are. And I think that then we can use the various tools of you know, developmental psychology and Marxist modes of production theory, and we can use our economics and our information. We can render the information and all the different kinds of sciences and knowledge forms to try to tell that story in the most accurate way that we can. And I think that there is a story to be told there, which I don't think that necessarily by revising or offering a revisionist account, you're necessarily throwing all of that out as being, it's all bunk either.
No, I just think we need a better story. I think
Sure.
we need a story that does more justice to the actual facts rather than you like because you can analyze stories to see the rhetorical
Yeah.
value and you can see probably who wrote the stories.
Yeah.
So you can see the probably the glorification of the 19th century scientific mindset in that narrative
Sure.
of Copernicus Galileo because they want to separate themselves from the church and kind of hold up lofty this idea of progress once you get
Sure.
rid of the tethers of that. With the postmodern one, I think you can see the remnants of where that story has come from. In this, it's like the analytic versus continental distinction in philosophy. It's like,
Mhm.
guess which side came up with that distinction. One of them is analytic, a philosophical term. One of them is continental,
Yeah.
those lads over there in the
Yeah.
continent. It's very clear which
Yeah.
rhetorically which side it's coming from.
Yeah.
And with postmodernism, that term is come. It's not as obvious on the can. But once you dig into it any bit and you look at people talking about postmodernism, you're going to get Stephen Hicks, you're going to get Jordan Peterson
Yeah.
talking about how this is the death of society. it's you get a lot of, and it's like Foucault identifies as an Enlightenment thinker, so it's there's
But
just a lot
Foucault
of
also, he said something sometimes and different things other times. And, I mean,
yeah, okay, that's fair.
I feel like trying to use the standard of, well, what did these people say about themselves isn't always the best for reasons we were talking about earlier. But let's zoom out a little bit and let's also bring it back a little bit more to the essays, which is um, you're using a term. Well, I guess here the question would go like this. What do you make of the idea of using a term? Let's use postmodernism, but I'm open to others. That there is a reaction to an objectification of, a reflection on, a critique of the kind of modern way of thinking and telling the story that you were just gesturing to, right? Like we can we can do a form of analysis that we can say, hey, that whole story of, Galileo and all this is told from a particular lens that clearly, we can say who it benefits, and we can kind of then interrogate that, and we can kind of question it and see that it's actually maybe a very partial view of history. Um, I find it to be a justified move to talk about that, doing that as a postmodern tactic. It's a strategy of interrogating a particular modernist frame and trying to get outside of it, and then critiquing it for why it's partial, and then foregrounding that. Now, I would call that, yeah, a modern and a postmodern distinction. Do you find that to be an objectionable framing, that postmodernism broadly can be seen as a response to those kinds of moves in modernity being, kind of critiqued and deconstructed, exposed in their various kinds of dynamics that are doing that?
I mean, it's an interesting question because now that we're talking about modernity, I'm like, well, what are we talking about? Because does it go back to the 12th century in that scientific mindset? Are we oscillating between McGill Christian, the romantic, and the more scientific mindset? Like, which modernity? Because the romantic idealism
Hmm.
is separate to the scientific, and you can see them wrestling out. So how do we nail down what it is? But I think that's where the model of hierarchical complexity can come in more because more and more things, as we get a more established thing of knowledge, we're beginning to question our premises more.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
as we'll say 19th century biblical exegesis, the rise of hermeneutics,
Hmm.
really what is Derrida doing but a sort of a secular hermeneutics? He's instead of applying that to a religious text, he's now going, hey, let me do a close reading of Saussure, let me do a close reading of Levi Strauss. So it's getting into this.
Hmm.
It's it's more or less a continuation of that tradition
Yeah.
rather than a break with it. And so I don't know. Does that work as any bit of a response or
No,
what do
no,
you?
it's good. It's just a lot of things come up for me though. One is, what would I say? So by asking, so you're asking the right question. Like, we shouldn't just presume that we know what modernity is. Asking these questions is this cultural studies analysis that we're engaged in. So it's not like, oh, we figured that one out. But in order to kind of make some progress and try to get some working answers for these questions, we do have to start proposing some, and we have to start delimiting things versus other things. There will always be ways in which, there are liminal aspects where, well, that doesn't quite fit there, or maybe that's not a good way, and maybe sometimes we need to go back to the drawing board. Maybe all of these categories are no good, but I think we can work with a kind of, yeah, working hypothesis and start making these divisions and things. And like that goes into any necessary kind of knowledge production. And I think that we can then acknowledge that these things can be critiqued, and we can show the spots where they don't work. But that is inherently just going to be kind of a skeptical, deconstructive move that doesn't allow us to kind of move forward. I just picked this up because I'm like, we could say, all right, what color is this? It's like, oh, well, it's yellow. Well, but if you zoom in really close to the black part, it's actually black, Like, and it's like, okay, yeah, but then we can say, all right, well, it's yellow, but it has black parts in it. And on the whole, it's mostly yellow. And then it's like, all right, well, but if I put it in a different light, then, if I put it under red light, now it's not yellow, it's brown. Anyway, these sorts of things, right? And it's like at a certain point, right, like what? Now we're getting to some really deep philosophical, epistemological
Yeah,
aspects here,
but
which is
because
not where we
I
have to go per se, but
like
yeah.
what how would McGilchrist characterize modernity then? Because he does because the black is going to be a lot more than that. He's going to have because the romantic right hemispheric depressive melancholic kind of side isn't the optimistic
Yeah.
portrait of utopian visionary that is characterized in the metamodern integral kind of circles. So
Yeah.
the picture they paint of modernism is the optimistic scientific left hemisphere side.
Uh-huh.
But that's cut up multiple times.
Yep.
And even in Storm's earlier book, he talks about disenchantment and how these
Yeah.
people that were proposing enchantment were actually in the midst of, the late 19th century occult revival.
Yeah.
So it's I don't know. And this is kind of where I'm at, is that I'm
Yeah.
going through a year where I'm just like, what do I believe? Because
Yeah.
I'm starting to pull these threads and there's not a satisfying thing. Because
Hmm.
I can feel that, like, and I'm not being disingenuous, I promise you, or I'm not trying to be,
Yeah.
I'm just going through what's going on in my mind where I'm
Yeah.
like, but I don't know if that story works. And yes, I do think it would be nice if we could get to agreeing on some super basic shit, but I'm just finding it hard to find where that is,
Yeah.
because when I pull that thread of what's modernity, I'm like, is this too big a story
Yeah.
to fit into that? And
Yeah.
even McGilchrist's story is ridiculously
Right.
simplified at a
Yeah.
at a massive level of, like, we got hemisphere. It's
Yeah.
crazy on
Yeah.
some level, but it's still got like twice the level of nuance of this, because hey, we don't need a single spiral anymore. We've got two hemispheres.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. So
No,
I want to play ball, but like I
yeah.
also I can't, because I can't just give you a very neat thing of modernity,
Sure.
because I don't know where that
And I
line
get that,
is.
and I think that that's important. As part of kind of this dialectical process, we shouldn't just take these things for granted. I think that really what this does get down to is a level of granularity, or how fine or coarse grained are we trying to get in our analysis. Like, if you think about a map of the world, and then if you've got like an 8-bit version of that, you can kind of make out the continents, and relative to the ocean blue, you can see the, continental green. And it's like, okay, I can make a distinction there. But then if you've got, a 4K picture on your computer, you're like, oh, I can see a lot more detail here. And yes, those are meaningful distinctions, but actually, look, there's also lakes in those continents, and so there's overlaps and all, right? Then, and of course, these even a 4K version is just still pixels, right? There's the reality of it, or there's a map the size of the territory, right? So I think that you can do these levels of zoom, and the point is always with philosophy to try to carve nature at its joints. Of course, we're not carving nature per se, we're carving culture at its joints. And so I think we can do similar kinds of moves, but they're a lot harder to do given the complexity of the topic that we're exploring. It's a lot harder to kind of differentiate one cultural epoch versus another, compared to, differentiating, one molecule from another or something. And a lot of that does relate
Or
to the
even
fact,
we can much easier distinguish between art, we'll say painting and architecture, or architecture and microbiology. It's what you're trying to do is like such a global level
yeah,
of discourse
right.
that it's very difficult to know if you can even, like, you can tell a convincing story, but compared to that kind of a distinction where that's a joint where we can find and we can cut,
Yeah.
because it's pretty neat and we've got a lot of consensus around that joint. But yeah, so I don't know that the zoom level here, that I think you think that I'm mistaking the ocean, or that, like, I'm zooming into like the coast of, we'll say, Newfoundland, and I'm saying, hey, but you've said the coast is like 100
Mhm.
miles long, but actually if we get in with a fractal thing and I'm measuring the crags in the
Mhm.
coast, it's
Mhm.
actually a lot longer. I don't think that I'm going to that level of
No, no.
granularity.
No,
I
you're
think,
asking the important question, which is like, okay, we're telling stories about massive cultural epochs here, and we're trying to make some theoretical model of developmental stages of epochs. And like, is that justified? Let's actually interrogate our categories here, and let's see if they make sense. And oh, when you do that, you find that there's a lot of problems. And like, yes,
yeah.
you're exactly right, and I totally agree with you. I think that the work that I'm trying to do is trying to answer that. It's trying to be like, all right, let's work with this. Let's work from the ground up. Let's also, I think, again, without like trying to get too philosophical, this does come down to an epistemological question, which is like a philosophical question. And I do think that in a certain way, these kinds of questions will shade into a kind of radical skepticism at a certain point, which we want to avoid. This is one of those things that postmodernism itself kind of foregrounded for us. And we want to say, all right, well, how can we justifiably avoid radical skepticism so that we can have some meaningful knowledge of the world? And so a lot of my work is about what is meaningful knowledge. And there are ways in which we can engage the world that is meaningful in a way that we can, let's say, I'm not a foundationalist, but there is a kind of base or something you can kind of eventually get back to, where if you don't hit there, then you're dealing with forms of knowledge that aren't, let's say, going to lead to your continued existence at a certain
Well,
point.
can I offer an
Sure.
alternative model here,
Yeah.
rather than modernity, rather than this historically grounded one,
Hmm.
one that's a bit more. something a bit different. So let's consider it as a network
Yeah.
and a network with a certain level of complexity. So when the number of what do they call the links between the nodes in so there's a term for we'll say the links. Number of links, it's probably
Uh-huh.
links. Number of links exceeds, I don't know, we'll say a billion. I'm just coming up
Yeah.
with these numbers and it's going to be embarrassing to a network theorist, but like so we can see, okay, going back to ancient Rome, it had a certain level of things. So it crossed the threshold. We call it a critical point, at which point we can call this modernity. If modernity was done as a what happens when you hit an excess of connective networks. Now, I don't think that's going to work necessarily because of the base, but maybe the base is what allows this to happen. So that could be something separate. Sorry, I'm working through this on the fly. So
Mhm.
you've got that, and then okay, modernity's gone. And we'll say 700 years later, 12th century Renaissance, it spikes up again. We've got 100 years. Okay, then there's the famine of 1315, then there's the Black Plague. So it's gone. There's the humanism and all that.
Mhm.
Right hemisphere, wonderful painting, wonderful art. Not really any contributions. Okay, we're in.
Man, such an anti-Renaissance
And it's
polemic
such
coming
a
out here.
it's such a playful thing because I love them, my favorite, but it's
Worthless
still
Renaissance painters. Yeah.
it's such a heretical point of view to
Yeah.
have in the 21st century that I love it because it's grounded in it. But then you come along, okay, the network has spiked up again in the 17th century, so everything's booted back up again. Then if you looked at it as this quantitative thing rather than a historical linear thing, you can talk about, and I'm just coming up with this
Mhm.
on the fly, so this isn't necessarily going to work, but I would say that maybe networks with a certain level of connections
Mhm.
are going to have more similar characteristics than adjacent historical points of view.
Mhm.
So rather than the,
Yes.
the
Yes.
14th century being more like the
Right.
15th century,
Yeah.
maybe maybe once you're looking at it through that kind of a thing, you can have that massive generalizable thing, but maybe it's not a historical thing. Maybe
Mhm.
it's not this epochal thing isn't going to work. And if you had that network perspective, you'd then be able to go, hey, we're talking about this kind of point of view, which is the tribal level. So these are people who have between 5 and 500 links in their network, something like that. So
Mhm.
you can say, okay, that's these we can now speak about societies across time and across the world
Yeah.
in a meaningful way with some level of thing. That
Yeah.
we're talking about these are the traits that show up at that level,
Yeah.
and this is the structure and the model of hierarchical complexity that fits in with that.
Yeah.
That is something I could get on board with. Very, very hard to quantify,
Yeah.
but it's the historical thing that I'm like, I don't know that this makes
Yes.
sense. And
Well, no,
again,
yeah,
like,
I think you're spot on. I mean, I could, be, uncharitable or not even that. I could, come back with my own
nuance it in a
skeptical.
way I don't think it's
Yeah, I
necessarily
mean, I could say,
uncharitable.
well, then if we're going to make links between nodes, we'd have to have a notion of what is a link in a node, and then you can, anyway. But
Yeah,
I,
100%. Like
the
you would
basic
have to do that if you were to build a solid theory out of it.
But
Yeah,
what
but
you're getting at essentially, though, is the kind of toy model of this that I'm more in line with, which is exactly as you said, that it's more about the complexity rather than some adjacency in periodization, right? And I think that you can quantify it, but you can also quantify it in multiple ways. Like if you look at the work of Ian Morris, for example, he looks at energy consumption, like kcal per capita, basically, and you can follow the increasing amount of energy consumption and relate that to cultural complexity. Now, the way I look at all this is as culture as a sort of dissipative structure that like you're moving into increasing levels of complexity, which means that you need increasing energy input coming into that to fight against the entropy. So you can look at that from the measure of energy inputs required. You can look at that from the level of structural complexity. But then, of course, we're talking about culture here. And so we're also talking about ideas, right? And then it's like, well, how do we measure the complexity of the ideas? And that is something that you can get out of the model of hierarchical complexity. And then even you could do all of that, but it doesn't capture a lot of other things that are also going to be going on that are more
mm,
contingent or maybe, based on their own certain kinds of law-like patterns, but have nothing to do with complexity. So it all becomes very messy. But what you're basically loosely getting at is the sort of approach that I think we need for this. I would just complicate it or multiply the complexity of it a couple of times because it's not just one single metric that like, oh, oh, we've crossed a threshold here and now we're in, something that we're going to call modernity. It's more like you've got a cognitive aspect that's being a fuel, a cognitive complexification process that is unfolding in relationship to a socio-cultural complexification process in a dynamic feedback loop. And you can separate those two in terms of the kinds of metrics you would use to be able to look at them, and so on and so forth. But
Mm.
at a certain point, then someone, you could say, well, this is all getting very complex, and are we actually explaining anything to a degree of some sufficient,
Yeah, I guess we've gotten into very exploratory territory, but it's really come downstream from me being like, these stagial models are just too
yeah,
neat a narrative for me, and like when I actually try and drill down into it, it just feels very uncomfortable, especially with the characterizations it's having to do of certain eras, like
totally.
primarily the modern and the postmodern, or even the pre-modern, as lumping all that in together as what do we but that's a whole other thing. But yeah, so it's stemming from that. But yeah, we're I'm very excited by what we're talking about, and I'm going to be thinking about it a lot.
Cool.
But yeah, we're getting into
Yeah.
tangential weeds at this point, I
Well,
guess.
I mean, it's both tangential weeds, but it's also like the weeds of like the most important aspect to this, because this is the answer to this issue. I think that the questions you're asking are the right ones, and the critiques you're posing are the right ones. But my hypothesis is that as we try to answer those questions, we don't destroy notions of complexifications of culture or developments of cultural logics per se. We just refine what we understand these to be and how they work, and come to appreciate all the deep intricacies of what's going on here. And let's say that's a big part of what happens, and then another part is we lose the dross of our simplified notions, right? Like there's so much about, and I'm sorry, integral people and integral philosophy, I love integral stuff in Wilber's work, it's great, but there's so much there that isn't right, and so we need to like be okay with that. We need to update our models. We need to get them more refined. We need to get them more empirically grounded. We have to, I think, get rid of things like morphic resonances and the habits of cosmos being laid down. Like those aren't explanatory models at all. We need to actually work with the most up-to-date developmental cognitive theory. We have to work with the most up-to-date sociological theories. And I think that a lot of these stage models, whether it's Wilber or Hansi, are making big gestures that are hard to cash out when you actually really, try to go to test them. Even Hansi's work, and I'll say this as a teaser, like the research I'm doing that's actually trying to put these notions to the test is getting different results than Hansi's model. And so while Hansi, I think, is a meaningful update of Wilber's stuff, I'd say he's also wrong, and I think that we can be more clear about this stuff. But that's my take. Is just that I think as we dig in and move through the critique, I think we're going to land on the other side of a much more nuanced and satisfying and generally explanatory model that is more or less still within that broad gestalt of developmental logics
Mm.
than, oh, we have to throw developmental logics entirely out the window and think about this as just, and this gets to one of the last essays that you wrote of sort of like there's a bunch of different perspectives and a bunch of different worldviews, and they're all kind of warring with each other, and we just have to kind of be open to the diversity. I think we can do better than that. And so that would be my hypothesis. But anyway, yeah.
So I mean, like just something you had me thinking about there is, well, what metamodernism is like, rather than like as a sociological thing, rather than as a the theoretical thing. And I think it's a community of people. Okay, you could say there's the culture studies crowd, and we haven't even talked about the fact that you know the ironic sincerity is more associated with like the far right than with any
Mm,
progressive
yeah.
kind of element.
Yeah.
But I think the metamodern community, as I see it, like in your group or in Hansi's work or in Storm's work, from as I've encountered it through you, it's it's people that are oriented towards process philosophy, process ontology, systems thinking, and I guess developmental psychology as well. And it's there's something kind of coalescing around that, you
Hmm.
know. And McGilchrist kind of fits in with that as well, and
Hmm.
Vervaeke kind of fits in with that. So
Hmm.
there's a sort of there's a subculture there.
Yeah.
Now, I might disagree with the terminology and with the narrative, but I think you can't deny, and this was something that I covered in one of the critiques where I said meta modern people in general are super earnest. There's like this honest quest for
Mm.
like and those plastic builds guy, they said it pejoratively of like, oh, this is like a search for meaning or religion or something like that. And I think there's an element of truth to that. And I think
Yeah.
there's like an earnest seeking that's going on.
Hmm.
And I think that to cloth that in metamodernism, I'm like, is that necessary? Do we
Mm.
need to put on a show of ironic sincerity when actually there's something else that's formed here that is very interesting? And even like Bruno Latour,
Hmm.
there's still this, it's alive in the philosophical tradition, and it's bringing in these different things. And I think that there's something in the metamodern movement that is alive.
Mm.
And so while I disagree with the term, I think there's still the subculture. I don't see it as the era that we're
Yeah.
moving
Yeah.
into, that we're living in. I see it as a subculture among many subcultures,
Yeah.
and it's a subculture I am partial to and that I'm sympathetic to because process philosophy slash ontology and systems thinking, development psychology, they're all super interesting to me, and I think there's something important in those,
Hmm.
and that's kind of what gets me excited there, rather than this. Yeah, it's the grand narrative shit that kind of puts me off because
Sure.
I'm like, do we have to do this?
Sure.
But there's also, and I think in the last critique, I went into kind of going back to Dumitrescu and this
Yeah.
the idea of metamodernism as if you're just a subculture among many subcultures, then there has to be a bit more scrappiness to your
Yeah.
existence
Yeah.
and there's less room for infighting. Because I
Yeah.
think that's what happened with Integral or in Jamie Wheel and Mark Manson's breakdowns of it. They were just like, well, it became a bit of a cult.
Yeah.
It was we had this spiral, everyone knew where you are,
Yeah.
and it reminds me of the sociological notion of like a total institution,
Mm.
where once you have a linear hierarchy, then everyone's fighting to get on top.
Mm.
And so it becomes this infighting kind of thing.
Mm.
And I think if metamodernism leans too much towards the hierarchization of things,
Yeah.
then I think you will end up with a dynamic like that and too much fighting among the community
Sure.
rather than being guided by here, we have these shared interests of things. There's a paradigm emerging here. Maybe we're working towards something and
Yeah.
there's something in that. And also this idea of like integration
Well,
and
and to your
we can see
point,
that.
and bringing us back to what I started with in terms of the plurality, the diversity of the metamodern discourse space is there's probably most of that. Like the whole grand narrative bit is really just the Hansi inflected metamodernism. And well, I shouldn't say that.
It's in
I
storms as well, though. That
well,
idea of like we need to deconstruct the deconstruct. We're
yeah,
moving beyond postmodernism via
yeah,
postmodernism.
right.
It's still implicit
Implicit,
there.
yeah. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I try to bring that out because I am that for me is a very exciting aspect about all of this. Though I also like for me, I just differentiate because like you make a lot of points about that I agree with about the pathology of, hierarchicalized subcultures and all this, pathological infighting and just things, all the breakdowns that we have seen in other kinds of communities where that's been important. Totally agree with all that. I don't want to see any of that happen in metamodernism. I see versions of it happening here and there, and I don't like it. Um, but I do think that there's something really compelling about situating all those things that you were just describing. The recognition of the importance of process thought and systems thinking, and the kinds of moves that Vervaeke's making into the transjective and bringing together wisdom and spirituality and meaning and all these things. Like there's a thing there, and I think that by appreciating that that's not just an accident, that it's not entirely contingent, that there is some logic to this comes out of a response to, I would call it this cluster of ideas that we've historically called postmodern ideas of radical skepticism and irrealism or anti-realism and and value nihilism that that there is a movement out of that through that's grappling with that and responding to it. And that's why I feel like it's not an accident that these kinds of answers are all clustering together and having a certain kind of structural, similarity to them. And to me, then that's exciting. Now people don't have to
But
lean
my
into
point
that.
with that
Yeah.
is that it's not going through it; it's going against it, and
So you
that's
don't think
fine
you don't
as
think
well.
Storm's work is responding to like an existing paradigmatic aspect of postmodern thought in a constructive way?
I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I don't think he was a postmodernist. He
I think he
doesn't.
was though. In fact, I would make I sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think he's one of the strongest cases because if you read his early work, like The Invention of Religion in Japan, we're talking classic postmodern moves here. It's like taking a category, what is religion? Oh, let's historicize it, let's deconstruct it, and then we'll say that it was invented, it's a social construction, all these things. That's very much early Storm's work. And then you get to like metamodernism, and he's like, yeah, I can do this. But
Mm.
what does it ultimately kind of get us? And I would also say for other people, who've only maybe, yeah, gotten Storm through my book, I'm doing a maybe even poor summary of his wonderful work. So I highly recommend people engage with it. But yeah, so anyway, he's an example in a way that I wouldn't say that about necessarily. Well, would I say that about Hansi?
But what
I
about the community even? I don't
yeah,
sense that this is a community of people who are partial to postmodernism. I see it as kind of, as I talked about in one of the critiques, more like Soule's constrained vision versus
mm,
unconstrained vision.
hmm
So you end up with like Peterson and Hicks, and a lot of, I think the metamodernists kind of seem to fit a lot of, are more like that search for meaning, that
yeah,
quasi-religious element.
yeah,
They seem to line up more on that side than on the kind of like the somewheres versus anywheres
yeah.
kind of thing. It,
Well,
it's
again,
it's
this I think gets to how we define the term. I define it broadly as postmodernism is a whole cluster of ideas that critiques and responds to modern prejudices and assumptions that were, that were predominant in sort of what we can think of as a paradigmatically modern thought, and then we can describe that. But let's just say the postmodern is critiquing that, and it's fine, and it's showing its flaws and its limitations, and it's like, oh, actually everything isn't just linear progress, and everything about industrialization doesn't just lead to, an increase in quality of life, and actually we're destroying the environment, and actually there's marginalized groups that we have to be, thinking about and that have been left out of the story and all this stuff. Postmodernism in that sense is reflecting on modern thought and showing where it doesn't match up or where it falls apart or where it's inconsistent or whatever, and it's able to do that outside of postmodernism. Now I feel like in doing so it raises questions, and it raises questions about what are categories and what's knowledge and what's truth and who's truth and all these things, a kind of a cluster or a system of interrogation. And I feel like what metamodernism broadly is doing is responding to those questions productively. And I think that the postmodernists, broadly speaking, raised the questions, emphasized the aporias and the uncertainties and the confusions and the kind of chaos and the relativism. And the metamodernists are all like the genuine ones, I think, are saying, yeah, those are all good points. So what do we make of that? Well,
mm,
let's carry that forward, and in Storm's way, right? Like, okay, let's take this negation, but let's now negate that, radicalize it on itself, and then move on to this other thing that's kind of taking that and going to the next phase that's actually a positive other side to all of these critiques. And I think that that's how I think about these things in terms of the modern, the postmodern, and the metamodern. Now, what's different though is that if someone wants to mean by postmodern, oh, these, woke ideologues who are, I don't know, people at
taking over the
protests or,
institutions and
yeah,
using it to,
and
yeah, the
like if that's
conspiracy.
what
Yeah.
we mean by postmodernism, then you're just going to get the Stephen Hickses and the Jordan Petersons who are waging a kind of closed-minded, I would say, culture war. I mean, they're not all wrong, but it's also just like it's very easy to reach the limits of that kind. Oh, okay, yeah, there's a bunch of people making some silly claims out there that are kind of having a negative
I mean, that's
effect.
when you get to pure straw man and
Yeah,
pure just rhetorical
yeah,
thing with no
right.
in-group content, at least with Storm and and your work, and to some degree Hansi's, since he does use Deleuze.
Yeah,
He talks about the individual. Like there is some charitable use of postmodern concepts. It's still it's a lot closer to
yeah,
what people would actually identify as, whereas that, like, they've just gone to red scare levels, where it's just
yeah,
like, hey, we're
yeah,
just
yeah. And
let's get our pitchforks out. These people
right.
are trying to take over the world.
And that's why I would call that just that's I don't even call that metamodern. That's anti-postmodern, right? That's just, oh,
Mm.
we like when I interviewed Hicks, Yeah, he's a smart guy. He does a nice little summary of modern philosophy, but I don't think he's a metamodern thinker at all. Everything, when I kept trying to get him to say anything good about postmodernism, he would just say, yeah, but that's actually just modernity. And so he doesn't see anything
Mm.
positive about postmodernism. I think a prerequisite for any metamodern move is to be able to grapple with the genuine insights of postmodernism. And those things are the contextualization of knowledge, the recognition of power dynamics as part of knowledge construction, engagement with various kinds of semiotic theories and questions of meaning. We could run the gamut
See,
of
I
like,
think that's an integral bit of integral DNA in the metamodern movement. It's the that charitableness of like, hey, we can learn. Like it's partly comes from the hierarchy, but partly comes from the just this attitude towards, hey, no one's wrong all of the time. Like let's
yeah,
actually listen here. And I think that's a wonderful thing that I would like to see the metamodern community really lean into is that potential for peacemaking,
yeah,
for building bridges, and because as you say, there is an attempt to understand the points there
yeah.
and to do something constructive with them
Well,
rather
but I
than
think
just
where it becomes really difficult though is that, you know, one, I think from a metamodern perspective can acknowledge these deep insights. Let's just use the example of like, culture or knowledge is culturally constructed, right? And say, oh yeah, we have to grapple with that. We can't just deal with this notion of absolute, view from nowhere, whatever. So let's deal with perspectivalism and all of that epistemologically and all that. Like, okay, yeah, like let's do that. But that's a different kind of connection versus let's say someone is saying that um, I don't know that the in order to take a course you have to write an essay, declaring the problematic nature of your privilege and your whiteness and own that and kind of have to do this kind of group speak thing just to be able to gain access to some kind of offering or something
do you have a
like
problem with that?
uh
To
and I mean yes, right, like that I would say that
that extent, I think, yeah, yeah.
where at that point I think these things are related but they're also very different, right? Like there are ways that people can operationalize or even weaponize certain kinds of postmodern insights from a very crude level of analysis,
Hmm.
and then we don't want to like, hey, let's partner up with this, right? So I think we are seeing a kind of pathologization of some postmodern insights that have filtered down from the academy to a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds who are like, oh, okay, I guess everything's about race and power. Like that's a very crude way of understanding the insights of postmodernism. And so we don't want to just then affirm that kind of downward assimilated, crude appropriation of these ideas. We actually are trying to work at this high level of analysis of being like, oh, okay, if you actually take seriously notions of the social construction of reality, what then, right? So these are different, and I guess is what I'm saying. And that some people, in using the term postmodernism to connect them, I think are in some sense justified, but it also leads to speaking past each other because some people will just equate like postmodernism with woke insanity, and some people are actually seeing it as an academic paradigm that has some legitimate, intellectual gains that it's made, and we want to build off of without, necessarily falling into its impasses. And those are different projects. So, yeah, there's a lot to all that.
Yeah, and you could identify those projects even within the metamodern community as different polarities,
Yes.
or as different points along the continuum. Like as you say, Storm is going to be much closer to, hey, it's a paradigm and we're trying to work through it, and then you could see other
Yeah.
people, maybe there's none of the big thinkers, but people in the community itself who will be like, yeah, fuck the
And
Posters.
and to bring it back, I think this is where again some of the cognitive complexity analysis can really help us understand why that's the case, right? So that we can actually begin to even differentiate within these broad paradigms levels of engagement with those paradigms, right? Like when I was at Yale and there was a walkout around the Halloween costumes, right? And a bunch of angry students yelling at administrators, right? Arguably, those 18-year-olds were not like actually engaging with the profound, deconstructive insights of postmodernism. They were taking a simplified version of, what became a kind of, yeah, more kind of crude race politics and internalized it, and we're getting really mad and acting out the way college students do. And we shouldn't conflate those things, even though they're using
Yeah.
similar terms and
I mean,
language,
I
right?
think Foucault would have had a field day to look at the force relations involved in something like that, and Foucault was criticized for not taking stances in his
Hmm.
work. He
Mm.
just laid out
Yeah.
all of his archival research that he'd done. So I'm sure he'd look at the power of that and
Yeah.
he'd be like, oh, let's look at the system of power that's working here. And it's such a weird thing to take that to be like, this guy, how it's ended up being of like
Yeah.
Foucault is justifying these
No, it's
students doing
I
this
love
stuff. And it's
I
like a
like
weird.
Foucault. I mean, like when I've gone to read Foucault, I'm always kind of like, well, there's a certain level of pretentiousness there for sure, but like I'm like, this is good stuff. Like I don't think you can
It's
get.
very readable compared to the others as well.
Oh, well, yeah. But like if you read, and I know it's early, but like the order of things, like what he's doing is an early move of appreciating, hey, there are systems of knowledge at play. And are these commensurable or are they not? And when you look at Kuhn, similarly, it's like people are asking these questions. Now, there's an early phase of that where you're like, I think this is what the postmodernists did. They're like, these are just different. They're just incommensurable. And so we live in this relativistic, oh, I come from this knowledge system, you come from this one, and that's the way it is. I think
Mm.
there's another level to that of the metamodern move of saying, yes, there are systems of knowledge that condition our thinking. Can we relate them? Yes, we actually can. And I think that this is a common move in the metamodern space to say, even the theory of paradigm shifts presumes the continuity of categories that we're actually saying are incommensurable, right? To say something can't be, and this is Storm's thought, to say that here's an idea, here's how it's so untranslatable because here's the word and now here's what it means and it's untranslatable. You've just provided a translation of what you've said is untranslatable. So I think that genuine metamodern thought, to the degree that we can think about that as a meaningful category, moves through the postmodern insights of the relativization and the contextualization and the socialization of thought. And rather than leaving that in a deconstructed and relativistic space, goes one step higher to try to totalize that or put that in a higher level of totality where these things can actually be related. That's the structural thing of the metamodern move. And I think if we see it that way, we can see all sorts of versions of this playing out across the different metamodernisms, which is kind of my point in the book. And yes, that is infused with a deep integral DNA, to use your term. Like there's this, it's a very similar kind of move there. I just think that a lot of integral, for various reasons, went in various directions. It didn't, that let's just
Oh
say
yeah, there's
aren't,
so much
yeah,
bathwater, but there's
yeah,
there's 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 some good things in there.
yeah,
Applying integrals lesson to its own thing, you can't get it wrong all the time.
yeah.
So good
Well,
job.
we should probably start to bring this to a close, but this has been awesome. Were there other aspects of the critique that you wanted to throw in while we still have a
Yeah,
minute?
I mean, I don't, I think we've pretty much covered everything that I had written down there, kind of going through them. Yeah, I mean, if there's any other little bit, I think we're in surprising agreement on the amount of it.
Hmm,
I had expected the decentration thing I would get more pushback on,
hmm.
but I see that that was really you. I understand what you were doing there. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. It was nice to bring a bit more clarity to my thoughts because, again, I'm still working through this. I still have these discontents, but trying to find that. I think there's a good spirit
Yeah,
in it, in a lot of the thinkers in the metamodern space. I'm really interested in what is trying to be done, and I think there's a core there that I relate
yeah.
to. But there's just a lot of stuff where I'm
Well,
like,
and to
come
your
on.
point too, like I'm very open to trying to find different terms and labels and language around all of this. I recognize the inherently problematic nature of telling certain tales or stories or grand stories about history in its unfolding and the categories that we use for these different epochs or structures or whatever.
Mm,
All that's really that can be difficult stuff. I think we can do it to greater or lesser degrees of clarity and intellectual integrity. And I think the worst aspects of stage models, popularized ones, have tended to do that poorly. I do think it can be done better. And I think, again, Habermas is, for me, kind of a gold standard here in terms of some of that. But other thinkers have been doing that. I'm trying in my current work to do this as rigorously as possible with this evolution of meaning series. So there is all that. But I will also say this is its own research paradigm, I guess, for me. It's kind of a sub paradigm within metamodernism as a broader paradigm. But like for me, the question of can we understand history and its modes of thought in any kind of structural patterning that can bring some higher level degree of cohesion and integrity to it? That to me is a fascinating question. And it's an interesting thing that's worth kind of giving its due. And I'm not sure that the answer will be yes. Like maybe ultimately the critiques, it's just too much and the thing falls apart. But I do think that we haven't yet probed the depths of how sophisticated we can be about asking this question. And I think if we do it in a sophisticated enough way, we can obviate most of the concerns that tend to be leveled at these things. Because everything that you say in your piece about the simplicity of stage models, I agree with. And we have to move through that if we're going to do anything more sophisticated. But again, on the other end of that, maybe it still just doesn't pan out, and maybe different models would be better for trying to make sense of this. But I find it too fascinating to give up too easily. So
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as a thing to research, it's of course valuable. I think ultimately, when it comes to that grand of a time period,
mhm.
there's always going to be a narrative, and that narrative is always going to play a rhetorical role. And so, being conscious in what that is, or being conscious of the fact that that is going on, yeah, it's trying to tell the best story, I guess. And that's where the religious overlap kind of comes in of like, hey, this is we're trying to tell the biggest story here.
Mm.
Story, the modern story into the postmodern story kind of has that secular versus church thing kind of coming through, and the rise of science and secular thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, to some degree, in looking at the metamodern discourse space, there's kind of what you could call like weak and strong metamodernisms. Like the cultural studies is a bit weaker in the sense of kinds of like commitments that it makes around
Mm.
these stories, whereas like the developmental one is much stronger in terms of its like developmental thrust. But I guess I would say that in the hmm, one last point I wanted to make around this, which is an interesting thing to consider, is that there is a particular kind of momentum here, and particularly with the sort of strong framing of this, it seems to speak to people, it seems to scratch an itch, and it seems to have a kind of, yeah, like social movement aspect to it. And that can be for good or ill. Oh, and this is kind of the point I wanted to make with the strong or weak. It's like a weaker form of metamodernism will say, well, we tell these grand stories because we have to, and they're not necessarily right, but they serve a certain function and they do something for us. And you find that even in the cultural studies framing of grand storytelling. And I think that's true. And so we should also have that framing in our mind in the background that, what do these stories allow us to do? What possibilities do they open up for us that other stories don't? Um, and for me, I think that there's something that a sophisticated, well done, well articulated developmental logic to cultural evolution, there's something that offers to us that I think is part of what galvanizes that energy in people and that interest and that fascination. But I think also to the point of all these critiques, our stories can hurt us too. And we want to make sure that we're not telling harmful stories or stories that lead to our own sabotage or implosion. And so that's something that we need to navigate going forward. But I think of whatever else metamodernism is as a kind of discourse, it has the potential and seems to be fulfilling some of this potential presently of serving as a kind of galvanizing narrative that people can gather around to make a meaningful change in society as it is deemed urgently necessary for our particular moment, right? That we live in a crisis-ridden moment. There are certain systemic inadequacies, particularly in academia and in our sort of broader cultural paradigm, that we are trying to correct for, and we're trying to move in a particular direction of. And so we need some kind of normative orientation relative to all of that. And I think metamodernism, again, whether it's a true or a good or a bad or a right or a wrong story, is moving in that direction. And I am hopeful that it will have, on the whole, a salutary effect, that it can bring in fresh life into the academy. It can open up new questions of research. It can allow us a more nuanced and complex way of looking at the world. And it can allow us to start to solve some of the thorny, knotty, systemic issues that we face together from a kind of higher vantage perspective that's required for that. So that's like, I'm hopeful for all that. And whatever else it is, I'm kind of pinning my wagon to that star or whatever for
Yeah.
also those reasons. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of name some of that pragmatic historical cultural context for some of this unfolding too.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I would be sympathetic to that. Yeah, again, the paradigmatic version, if I'm fully on board with that, but as long as the stripping out of the postmodern, yeah, I'm for the positive orientation towards, hey, let's have a new research paradigm that offers novel possibilities and that
Mm,
orients us in a new, maybe helpful, constructive direction.
yeah.
And I'm all on board for that, but it's the getting there
Yeah.
without the. Actually, I do have a recommendation,
Yeah.
or just an alternative, which is there's another book on the postmodern philosophers, or that era of philosophers, written by a couple of conservative French philosophers in the early 90s, so like
Mm.
very close to the time, and they've read every single one of them. So they go through Derrida, Foucault, Althusser, and maybe one other
Hmm.
of that era, but they call them the philosophers of 68
Hmm.
because 1968 is the watershed moment,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that is I think that there's something telling in that term because
Yeah.
those philosophers all very much transformed after 1968 and entered into the domain of activist and more radical kind of
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah.
So I think that seeing them as the 68 philosophers or searching for the root of the philosophy in the roots of that 68 movement, which ties in with
Yeah.
Vietnam, it ties in with
Yeah.
a lot of different things. There's something there that, and it was also a refreshing book because it's not drenched in it's so boring. It's so dry.
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Everything you read about postmodernists is people hyping them, being
Oh,
like they're
I
so
know.
interested, they're talking about this stuff, or people being like they're demonic.
Yeah.
And it's just
Yeah.
it's nice to find someone who just treats them in the same way you'd read about someone deconstructing Thomas More's Utopia. It's just something
Yeah.
boring where you're like, oh, these are just some other thinkers that like people will talk about this way in 100 years
I
rather
totally
than
agree. I mean, that's why, yes, I totally agree with that. And I let me know what this book is, and I'll get that one too, because I think those are the kinds of analyses that I actually put some weight in. And to be clear, like again about Hicks, I don't think Hicks does a good job with this topic. I think he has a
yeah.
couple of insights, but it's a polemic. It's not, if you're looking to his postmodernism book to understand postmodernism, which I think is actually the name of the book. No, it's a very
Yeah. It's a neat narrative.
yeah.
But
And there's
it's
some truth to it as well, but I don't think that if that's what you're wanting to understand as postmodernism, you've already jumped into a highly ideological, polemicized version of it, and so there's a lot better that we can do. Two quick last things is one is the more I'm thinking about this too, I also do want to speak to the fact that, the first thing I'll say, because it's most related to what you just said, is we didn't touch on this in its own conversation, but there's a whole way in which postmodernism and the postmodern thinkers, in the way that you're talking about, is related to coming out of 68. There is a political element to this, right? And we can't ignore that. We shouldn't ignore it. It's hard to, it would be how do you say, we have to acknowledge the fact that a lot of this paradigm is coming out of a leftist tradition, let's say, broadly speaking, right? And that is also why there's such a reaction to it from the right, right? It's not a coincidence that people like Jordan Beers and Hicks and all
oh,
these,
without a
you know,
doubt. Yeah.
and so while postmodernism on the one hand can be seen as an academic paradigm that's making certain intellectual moves and a philosophical level, it's also a kind of political movement in its own way. And these things need to be disentangled if we're going to be more coherent about what are we actually attending to, right? Because people on the right will just kind of knee jerk say, oh, those nasty postmodernists. And yeah, so there's that distinction that I wanted to make. And trying to untangle some of the political history from the philosophical history would be, I think, an important move to make, because I think it's also inextricable. You can't understand the direction that the academy has taken if you don't understand, political movements since the 60s on. So I wanted to say that. But then the other thing I wanted to say is that, as I've been reading more people who've been talking about postmodernism from earlier on, there have been these distinctions made that people will talk about deconstructive or quote unquote reconstructive postmodernism. This was a term in the 90s that some scholars were getting behind, who were of the more kind of reconstructive, kind of productive, I would say, that kind of tenor. They are engaging that term in a positive way, and they're saying we kind of need to move into that. And I think that you could do some work around uncovering a lot of thinkers who were engaging the term postmodernism in that sense once it had reached a certain kind of cultural saturation and certainly academic saturation, where scholars were being like, oh, okay, I guess we're postmodern now. Well, I'm not liking some of this aspect of postmodernism, but we can lean into this aspect. And you find that in a bunch of process thinkers and others. So I wanted to say that too. And that the last thing I'd say about that is that term reconstructed postmodernism, I think we can now associate, or no, how do I want to say this? The term we use, metamodernism, again, I use in a rather capacious way, and not in a way to try to totalize or colonize or whatever, appropriate earlier things, but just in the broadest sense of people recognizing insights of postmodernism, but trying to do the next move and a reconstructive move with them. We can see that going back into the 90s, and if not earlier. And so I think that what we're now calling metamodernism, we could more liberally apply to things that have been going on since the 90s as people people have been grappling with the postmodern paradigm and trying to work through and beyond it. Those were just a couple of thoughts I wanted to throw in as, they related to what we've been
Yeah.
talking about.
I think we just need more more constructive work so we can deconstruct it in another 100 years. It's just I think there's that thing of it's because
Yeah.
what is deconstruction but like super close reading and
Mm,
being super attentive to the thing. Well, we need to give them more fodder.
yeah.
Need to
Yeah.
give future deconstructionists something to deconstruct rather
Yeah.
than just
Well,
deconstruct and
yeah.
deconstruct.
I mean, of course, I would say there will come a time when metamodernism needs to be thoroughly deconstructed. And I mean, to a small degree, you're helping with that, right? Because you're asking those tough
Yeah.
questions and critiquing and doing the close
Although I'm
reading. So,
aware that I've been woefully inconsistent with my use of the term postmodern in this, I would hate to go back and be like, no, you can't use it that way, and then 5 minutes later using it that way. It's just hard with
yeah.
once terms are there, it's hard to not use them.
Well, this has been incredibly rich and really deep. And for those people, hopefully, who really appreciate this stuff, this will be a real delight, I think. And then for those for whom it isn't, they'll just have stopped
They'll
listening
have
a
tuned out a
long
long
time
time
ago.
ago.
But thank you so much. Thanks for your all the stuff that you're doing. Why don't you just make a quick final plug for the stuff that you're up to so that people can find more of your work and engage with it?
Yeah, I mean, if you like reading, I live in philosophy.com and that's my Substack. Or if you like video forms, then I live in philosophy on YouTube. And I'm now kind of, as well as having gone through my disillusion with metamodernism, I'm working through my disillusion with Jung at the moment
Oh,
on the channel. So,
yeah.
yeah, it's a time of burning away. So,
Mm.
if you're interested in that, then you can check out either of those platforms.
Really exciting. I'm really interested to see where you'll be at, with all this stuff in a number of years and
I can't wait to have solid ground under my feet again. Just like to have the confidence that I had a year and a half ago or
But
2 years
but
ago.
props to
But
you though for also being cool with sitting with the uncertainty and the uncomfortability. That's
I don't have a choice.
that.
There's nothing
Yeah.
else to do. It's happened,
I
and
guess they
it's my
call that, but
job.
they
So
call
I'm
that
like,
intellectual integrity. So, there it is.
oh,
Hey,
that's pretty
James,
good.
amazing stuff. Thank you so much, my friend. Till next time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brendan. That was an amazing chat. Thank you.